Genesis, Creation, and Early Man by Father Seraphim Rose. Part 2. The Philosophy of Evolution. Chapter 1. Science and the Holy Fathers. Editor's note: this chapter has been taken from among the miscellaneous notes of Father Seraphim, found after his repose. Each section represents a separate set of notes. We have chosen and arranged those notes which provide the best introduction to the chapters that follow. Other miscellaneous notes of Father Seraphim may be found in Appendix 1. 1. True Theology and Secular Knowledge. The attack of modern atheistic thought on Christianity has been so effective that many Orthodox Christians are defensive and feel inferior about their own Orthodox wisdom, and are very willing to admit that there is truth and wisdom to be found in modern secular knowledge about which Orthodoxy has no opinion. They thus undervalue the immeasurably rich tradition of the Holy Fathers, which gives us Christian wisdom, not by any means only on narrow ecclesiastical or theological subjects, but on much else. Patristic wisdom comprises an Orthodox Christian's whole philosophy of life, including his attitude toward modern conveniences, scientific knowledge, and other things which did not exist in their modern form in the lifetimes of the Holy Fathers of the past. Roman Catholic theology long ago gave up trying to give the standard of wisdom to contemporary men, with the result that it is now generally assumed that answers to many modern questions are to be found in modern wise men, scientists, and even philosophers. Orthodox Christians know better than this, and must be quite careful in deciding how much to believe these wise men. One area of common confusion is the interpretation of Genesis, especially in view of the scientific theory of evolution. It is no exaggeration to say that many even among Orthodox Christians assume that science has much to say in helping Christians to interpret the text of Genesis. Here we shall examine this assumption, not at first by examining directly the theory of evolution, about which of course the Holy Fathers did not speak directly, since it is a product of 18th and 19th century Enlightenment thought which was unheard of in earlier centuries, but chiefly by examining the attitude of the Holy Fathers toward secular knowledge, on the one hand, and their principles for understanding and interpreting Genesis, on the other hand, and also their interpretation of Genesis itself. No one will dare to say that the Holy Fathers and Orthodox Christians in general are against science, that is, opposed to scientific knowledge insofar as it is actually knowledge of nature. As God is the author both of revelation and of nature, there can be no conflict whatever between theology and science, as long as each is true and remains in the sphere which belongs to it by nature. Further, those Holy Fathers who wrote commentaries on the book of Genesis did not hesitate to make use of the scientific knowledge of nature known at that time, insofar as it was applicable to the subject. Thus Father Michael Pomazanski, in a perceptive article comparing the Hexameron of St. Basil with the homilies on the days of creation of St. John of Kronstadt, notes that the Hexameron of St. Basil to a certain degree is an encyclopedia of the knowledge of the natural sciences of his time in their positive attainments, his intention being to show the greatness of God as it is still visible in the obvious kinds of creatures. Footnote: Fr. Michael Pomazanski, 1888–1989, one of the last living graduates of a pre-revolutionary theological academy, was a theological writer for whom Father Seraphim had great respect. Father Seraphim translated and annotated the English edition of Father Michael's major work Orthodox Dogmatic Theology. Return to text. The knowledge of the natural sciences, to be sure, is one that is constantly open to revision owing to new findings made by observation and experiment, and so it is that there one may find errors even in the writings of St. Basil and other Holy Fathers, just as there are errors in the works of everyone who writes concerning scientific facts. These errors in no way detract from the overall value of such works as the Hexameron, wherein scientific facts are never used as more than illustrations of principles which derive, not from knowledge of nature, but from revelation. With regard to knowledge of the facts of nature, modern works of science are of course superior to the scientific part of the Hexameron and similar works of Holy Fathers, being based as they are on more precise observations of nature. This is the one and only respect in which science can be said to be superior or improve on the writings of the Holy Fathers, for this is a point which in the Holy Fathers is quite incidental to other theological and moral teachings. But let us distinguish quite carefully between actual scientific facts and something quite different which is today, when different kinds of knowledge are not often carefully distinguished, often confused with fact. Father Michael Pomazanski continues. Saint Basil acknowledges all the scientific facts of natural science. But he does not accept the philosophical conceptions or the interpretations of the facts which were contemporary to him. The mechanistic theory of the origin of the world, the teaching of the eternity and unbeginningness of the natural world, and the like. Saint Basil the Great knew how to raise himself above the theories contemporary to him concerning the basic principles of the world, and his hexi, Degree Morone, stands out as a bright and exalted system which reveals the meaning of Genesis and reigns above the former theories, as a bird soars above the creatures which are able to move only along the earth. The conceptions and theories of present-day Cyrus, such as the theory of evolution, are clearly of the same order as was that part of the science contemporary to him which Saint Basil did not accept, inasmuch as it was clearly opposed to Christian revelation. We shall see in what follows whether or not the theory of evolution is an exception to this general rule that the independent philosophical speculations of non-Christians, which always have a greater or less appearance of scientific fact to support them, have no part in the Orthodox Christian worldview, which is founded on divine revelation as interpreted and handed down by the Holy Fathers. One thing more should be said about the distinction in the very nature and quality of theological knowledge and scientific knowledge. The former proceeds from God's revelation and is judged according to its faithfulness to that revelation, and it leads the soul up to its source, while scientific knowledge proceeds from the facts of the physical world, and it has no purpose but to be faithful to the facts. One need only read the commentaries on Genesis of Saint Basil the Great, Saint John Chrysostom, Saint John of Kronstadt, or any of the Holy Fathers, to see how these Holy Fathers constantly use the knowledge which is available to them, whether theological knowledge of God's doings or just scientific knowledge of God's creatures, to draw the reader's mental gaze up to the Creator, offer moral instruction, and the like, but never to rest content with the mere abstract knowledge of things. Footnote. Here Father Seraphim goes on to quote Saint Gregory Palamas on the distinction between true theology and secular knowledge. We have omitted these quotes here since they are contained in Part 3, see pages 423 to 24. Return to text. We shall have occasion later on to remember the distinctions between secular and theological knowledge. For now let it be sufficient for us to know that secular knowledge can teach us nothing about God's revelation that is not contained in that revelation itself. If it attempts to do so, it is trying to measure the divine by human reasoning. In particular, those who think to interpret parts of Genesis by means of the evolutionary theory must be prepared to find clear, theological evidence of that theory in God's revelation. 2. Science and Christian philosophy. The Russian philosopher Ivan V. Kirievsky, 1806–1856, a disciple of Elder Macarius of Optina, wrote, "The sciences in their essential part, i.e. as knowledge, belong equally to the pagan and Christian world, and are distinguished only by their philosophical side. Catholicism could not give them this philosophical side of Christianity, because she did not possess it herself in pure form. And so we see that the sciences, as the inheritance of paganism, have flourished powerfully in Europe, but have ended in atheism, as an inevitable consequence of their one-sided development. Christian philosophy alone can give to the sciences a correct foundation. In Russia, as opposed to the West, all the Greek Holy Fathers, not excluding the most profound thinkers, were translated and read and copied and studied in the quiet of our monasteries, these holy embryos of the universities which did not exist. Isaac of Syria, the most profound thinker of all the philosophical writers, remains to this time in copies of the 12th and 13th centuries, and these monasteries were in living, unceasing contact with the people." Footnote. In his survival course, Father Seraphim said of Kirievsky, having himself been a son of the West and gone to Germany to study with the most advanced philosophers, Hegel and Schelling, he was thoroughly penetrated with the Western spirit and then became thoroughly converted to orthodoxy. Therefore he saw that these two things could not be put together. He wanted to find out why they were different and what was the answer in one's soul, what one had to choose. He did not come back to orthodoxy in order to be against the world without understanding it. Rather, it was in orthodoxy that he found the key to understanding the history of the Western world and what was happening there. It is noteworthy that Kirievsky's former teachers Hegel and Schelling, with whom he was personally acquainted, were the first major philosophers in the West to propound the philosophy of spiritual evolution. This was many years before Charles Darwin came out with his biological theory, see page 562. Besides writing philosophical works of his own, Kireevsky was instrumental in helping his elder, Macarius of Optina, to edit and publish major patristic works which were sent all over Russia. See Father Leonid Kavalin, Elder Macarius of Optina, pages 287 to 307. Return to text. This is the foundation of true enlightenment. The sciences now have gone far astray, their knowledge twisted, because they have no Christian foundation. Thinking to make their own foundation, they have stumbled over their own unconscious presuppositions and have stupidly assumed the prejudices of the spirit of the age. Present-day sciences exist in a state of learned ignorance, a mass of details in a context of stupidity. Contemporary science exists in a state of philosophical barbarism, a true dark ages of knowledge. Only true Christianity can give it true philosophy. 3. Distinguishing materialistic fantasies from scientific truth. Bishop Ignatius Bryanchaninov, 1807 to 1867, teaches that for true philosophy today, one must know both true Christianity and true science. Without this, one can't distinguish materialistic fantasies from scientific truth. Footnote. In his book The Soul After Death, Father Seraphim wrote of Bishop Ignatius. He was perhaps the first great Orthodox theologian to face squarely the very problem which has become so acute in our own days: how to preserve the authentic Christian tradition and teaching in a world that has become entirely foreign to orthodoxy and strives either to overthrow and dismiss it or else reinterpret it so that it can be made compatible with a worldly way of life and thinking. Acutely aware of the Roman Catholic and other Western influences which were striving to modernize orthodoxy even in his days, Bishop Ignatius prepared for the defense of orthodoxy, both by delving deeply into the authentic Orthodox sources, whose teaching he absorbed in some of the best Orthodox monastic centers of his time, and by familiarizing himself also with the scientific and literary culture of his century. He attended an engineering school, not a theological seminary. Armed thus with a knowledge both of Orthodox theology and of secular knowledge, he devoted his life to the defense of authentic orthodoxy and to an exposure of the modern deviation from it. It is no exaggeration to say that no other Orthodox country in the 19th century possessed such a defender of orthodoxy against the temptations and errors of modern times. Return to text. He, Bishop Ignatius, writes, "It is to be desired that some Orthodox Christian, having studied the applied sciences, would then study the fundamentals of the asceticism of the Orthodox Church, and bequeath to mankind a true philosophy, founded upon precise knowledge, and not upon arbitrary plus hypotheses. The Greek sage Plato forbade the exercise of philosophy without the prerequisite study of mathematics. This is a true view of the matter. Without a prerequisite study of mathematics, together with the other sciences based upon it, and without the active and eight-race-filled knowledge of Christianity, it is impossible in our time to set forth a correct philosophical system. Many who consider themselves adepts in philosophy, but are unacquainted with mathematics and the natural sciences, upon encountering arbitrary fantasies and hypotheses in the works of materialists, will not be able in any way to differentiate them from knowledge derived from science itself, and will not be able in any way to give a satisfactory response and evaluation of the most absurd ravings of any kind of dreamer. Very often they are attracted to these ravings to the point of delusion, having taken them as evident truth." Footnote. Interestingly, Bishop Ignatius wrote this at about the time Darwin's Origin of Species came out in England. Return to text. 4. Science as a lower form of knowledge. The Orthodox Christian is not against science, but he expects from science only that knowledge which it is capable of giving, by its very nature, not theology, not a philosophy of life. Yet in our time of intellectual confusion, when science has achieved such prestige in the popular mind as to be synonymous with knowledge itself, it happens all too often that scientists presume to teach that which they did not learn by means of science at all. Such scientists, in fact, talk like theologians. Modern science thinks it is knowledge par excellence, and before its prestige Orthodox believers waver, often apologizing for believing what seems unscientific, remaining content with the pietism or religious feeling, which is the place where the scientific establishment allows faith today. But true Orthodox Christianity is quite different. It is not bound up with any current of modern thought. It is a knowledge superior to science, and it certainly need not apologize to a lower form of knowledge. We know God created the world in measure, number, and weight, Wisdom 11:20. But God has not revealed to man the details of his ordered creation, and those who pry into the mystery of nature find out only an infinitesimal part of the mysteries which come from God's infinite wisdom. Modern science has proved that fallen man is not capable of using well what knowledge he has obtained. But modern science is not only knowledge. It has divorced itself from revelation, and therefore placed itself at the disposal of heretical, unchristian, and anti-Christian theories and philosophies. Often these conflict with revelation because they enter the realm open only to theology. So it is with the doctrine of the first man. God has not revealed many details of the first state of his creation, but it is sufficient to judge the philosophical religious speculations of evolutionists. The Orthodox doctrine of creation has not been known in the West. The Roman Catholic doctrine is quite different. 5. An alien system of thought. There is much confusion about evolution. Some say, Orthodox Christians have no quarrel with evolution, or they use the one phrase God-guided evolution. This understanding of evolution is rather primitive, assuming it is a scientific fact on the level of heliocentrism. In fact, those opposed to evolution are often compared to the Roman Catholic Church against Galileo, and even Orthodox Christians are rather afraid to be found naive, or be left behind the intellectual currents or fashions of the age. But the whole doctrine of evolution is rather more complex than of a single scientific fact or even hypothesis. And it is a doctrine, a belief involving many spheres of thought and by no means just science, and it is sufficiently coherent to be able to speak of it as a more or less coherent doctrine. We shall find it to be a whole distinctive approach to reality, with its own distinctive philosophical and theological presuppositions and deductions. In theology, in particular, it offers a conscious alternative to Orthodox Christianity on a number of key dogmas. 6. The lack of philosophical culture among Orthodox Christians. The misunderstanding of evolution on the part of some Orthodox Christians comes from a want of philosophical culture. 1. They do not have a critical approach to scientific findings, although, in full harmony with the modern spirit, they do have a critical approach to Scripture, and do not understand the nature of scientific evidence, which supposedly supports evolution, nor know how to distinguish between fact and philosophy. They are unnecessarily awed by scientific experts, and do not take the necessary trouble to investigate the question themselves. 2. They do not understand the philosophical spirit of the age, which gave rise to evolution, and therefore they naively accept the scientific fact of evolution, but reject the finished philosophy of evolution as entire hard to charden. They do not see that these are one whole. Without the philosophy, there would never have been the fact of evolution. 3. They do not understand the philosophy of the Holy Fathers, their whole outlook on nature and on specific questions such as the natures of individual things. 7. The philosophy of the Holy Fathers. The Fathers said nothing about evolution. This is used by many Orthodox as an excuse for actually believing whatever one wants or whatever science says on this subject. But our attitude to the Fathers must be more serious and more profound than this. Being faithful to the Fathers does not mean merely being ready to quote them or feel free to think as one pleases if no quotes are available. Rather, it means entering into their thought, which is the thought of the Church of Christ, and having a coherent philosophy of life derived from our life in the Church in harmony with the thought of the Fathers. And the Fathers did have a philosophy, indeed a theology, which encompasses the question of evolution and makes it absolutely clear what the Orthodox Christian must think about this question. Evolution is not a heresy, any more than Buddhism is a heresy, but it includes, implies, and presupposes so many errors and false views as to be totally incompatible with Orthodox Christianity. Most Orthodox believers have not thought deeply on this question, and so in their carelessness they think it is somehow possible to accept evolution. The rest of this study will attempt to clarify this issue, to make Orthodox Christians aware of the implications of Orthodox theology and the philosophy of the Holy Fathers, which have a very clear view of the chief questions raised by evolution for Christian believers. Chapter 2. A brief critique of the evolutionary model. Editor's note: this chapter has been transcribed from a taped lecture that Father Seraphim gave during his Orthodox survival course in the summer of 1975. The section titles and some additions to the text have been taken from his written outline of the course. Additions have also been taken from previous lectures in the same course, which provide necessary background to the present discussion. 1. Introduction. Now we come to a key concept which is extremely important for understanding both the religious and the secular outlook of contemporary man. This idea is an extremely complex one, and here we can give only a sketchy outline of the problems involved in this question. Charles Darwin's Origin of Species came out in 1859, was instantly accepted by many people, and soon became very popular. People such as T.H. Huxley and Herbert Spencer in England, together with Ernst Haeckel in Germany, author of The Riddle of the Universe, 1899, and others, popularized the ideas of Darwin and made evolution the very center of their philosophy. It seems to explain everything. Of course, people like Nietzsche picked it up and used it for their so-called spiritual prophecies. Thus, the people who were in the main school of Western thought, which was rationalism carried as far as you can take it, accepted evolution. To the present day, one can say that evolution is a central dogma of advanced thinkers, of people who are in harmony with the times. From the very beginning, however, there were people who were arguing about this. In the time of Darwin, there was a Catholic thinker, St. George Jackson Mivart, author of On the Genesis of Species, 1871, who believed in evolution but not in Darwin's idea of natural selection, which reduced Darwin to despair because the latter discovered that his idea could not be proved. Especially in the last 10 to 30 years, there have come out many critical accounts of evolution from an objective point of view. As these works demonstrate, most of the books supporting evolution begin with certain premises and assumptions arising from the naturalistic outlook. Now there is even a society in San Diego called the Institute for Creation Research, which has come out with several good books. They themselves are religious, but they have several books which discuss evolution quite objectively, not at all from a religious standpoint. They say there are two models for understanding the universe. One is the evolution model, and another is the creation model. They take the evidence of the history of the Earth, for example, the geological layers and so forth, and they try to see which model it fits. They have discovered that fewer adjustments have to be made if one follows the model of creation. If there was a God who created things in the beginning, and if the Earth is not billions of years old, but only some thousands of years old. The evolutionary model, on the other hand, requires a good many corrections. In this regard, it can be compared to the old model of the Ptolemaic universe versus the Copernican model. Footnote: the Ptolemaic model held that the sun and planets revolve around the Earth. It was replaced by the Copernican model, which holds that the Earth and planets revolve around the sun. Return to text. Like the Ptolemaic model, the evolutionary model is now proving quite cumbersome. Some members of this institute travel around to various universities. In the last year or two, they have held several debates before thousands of spectators at universities in Tennessee, Texas, etc. Interest has been quite high. Those defending evolution have not been able to give sound evidence in support of it, and, in fact, on several points were caught on their ignorance of recent discoveries in paleontology. There are very sophisticated and knowledgeable people defending both points of view. Here we will not even discuss the question of atheistic evolution, because it is obviously a philosophy of fools, of people who can believe, as Huxley said, that if you put a group of monkeys together with typewriters, they will eventually give you the Encyclopedia Britannica, given enough time, if not millions then billions of years, according to the laws of chance. Footnote: cf. Psalm 13 verse 1. The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. Return to text. Someone calculated evolutionary theory according to the laws of chance, and found that in fact such a thing would never happen. Anyone who can believe that can believe anything. The more serious dispute is between theistic evolution, that God created the world and then it evolved, and the Christian point of view. Here we must say that the fundamentalist point of view is incorrect in many instances, because the fundamentalists do not know how to interpret Scripture. They say, for example, that the book of Genesis must be understood literally, and one cannot do this. The Holy Fathers tell us which parts are literal and which parts are not. The first misunderstanding that must be cleared away before even discussing this question is one that causes many people to miss the point, and that is that we must distinguish between evolution and variation. Variation is the process by which people make various hybrids of peas, different breeds of cats, etc. After 50 years of experimentation, for example, they came up with a new breed of cat, a combination of Siamese and Persian, called the Himalayan cat, which has long hair like a Persian with the coloring of a Siamese. At first this had happened accidentally, but the cat was never able to reproduce itself purely, and only now after all these years of experimentation have they come up with a new breed which breeds true. Likewise, there are different breeds of dogs, different varieties of plants, and the very races of men are all quite different. Pygmies, Hottentots, Chinese, Northern Europeans, all different types of human beings who came from one ancestor. Therefore, the question of variation is one thing, and must be distinguished from evolution. Footnote. In his notes, Father Seraphim writes, "The popular mind accepts mere variation as proof of a much bigger question of evolution. We leave it to scientists to define the limits of change observable to them. By its grandiose conception, evolution as such cannot be proved by the small variations observable by science today. Let scientists define the limits of variation, and let them use the word and concept of evolution in explaining change. But let them abandon metaphysical schemes which strive to extrapolate small changes into an all-encompassing principle. If this latter is true, let it come naturally from the data without forcing an interpretation on facts." Return to text. There are undoubtedly many variations within one kind of creature, but these variations never produce anything new. They only produce a different variety of dog or cat or bean or people. In fact, this is more of a proof against evolution than for it, because no one has ever been able to come up with a new kind of creature. The different species, and this term is itself quite arbitrary, for the most part are not able to bear offspring with each other, and in the few cases where they can, the offspring is not able to reproduce itself. Thus, St. Ambrose of Milan says, "This is an example to you, O man, to stop meddling in the ways of God. God means for each creature to be separate." 2. Historical background. During the period of the Enlightenment, the worldview was quite stable. Just before this time, the Anglican Archbishop Usher of Armagh calculated all the years given in the Old Testament genealogies and came up with the idea that the world was created in the year 4004 BC. Footnote. The Archbishop's finding was published in 1650 and was soon added as a marginal notation the Book of Genesis in the authorized version of the Bible. His calculation was based on the Masoretic, Hebrew, text of the Old Testament. According to the Old Testament chronology in the Septuagint Greek text, which is used by Orthodox Christians, the earth is approximately 1,500 years older than Archbishop Usher's calculation. Return to text. Newton believed this, and the enlightened worldview was in favor of the idea that God created the world in 6 days and then left it to develop itself, and that all the species were just as we see them today. The scientists of that time accepted that. At the end of the period of enlightenment, however, as the revolutionary fever began to come on, this very stable worldview began to break down, and already some scientists were coming up with more radical theories. At the end of the 18th century, Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles Darwin, had already come up with the hypothesis that all of life comes from one primordial filament, which is exactly what is meant today by the theory of evolution. Footnote. Erasmus Darwin's book Zoonomia, in which he proposed this theory, was published in 1794. Return to text. His theory did not concern only one species or kind of creature, but proposed that a primordial blob or filament developed into all the different kinds of creatures by transmutations. Would it be too bold, he asked, to imagine chat in the great length of time since the earth began to exist, perhaps millions of ages before the history of mankind? Would it be too bold to imagine that all warm-blooded animals have arisen from one filament? This new explanation of Erasmus Darwin was an attempt to continue the spirit of the Enlightenment as utter rationalism and simplicity. As rationalism entered deeper into the mind, it was simpler, he thought, to explain life as coming from a single living filament than to give the more complicated explanation that God gave being all at once to all different kinds of creatures. Footnote. The term Darwinism was first applied to Erasmus Darwin's theories about evolution, which included natural selection. These theories contributed much to the ideas of his grandson Charles, although the latter never acknowledged the debt. Return to text. There was one naturalist, Chevalier de Lamarck, author of Philosophie zoologique, 1809, who had a definite evolutionary theory just after this, but he had the idea that the changes necessary to account for the evolving of one species into another were due to the inheritance of acquired characteristics. This could never be proved, and has in fact been quite disproved. Hence, the idea of evolution did not take hold. There was, however, one important geologist at this period of the early 19th century who gave a great impetus towards the acceptance of this idea of evolution. This was Charles Lyell, who in 1830 came up with the theory of uniformitarianism, that is, that all we see in the earth today is due not to catastrophes, to a sudden flood or something similar, but rather to the fact that the processes operating today have been operating in past ages, from the beginning of the world, as far back as we can see. Therefore, if we look at the Grand Canyon, we see that the river has been eating away the canyon, and we can calculate, by taking into account how fast the water flows, how much water there is in it now, the quality of the soil, and so on, how long it must have taken to wear away the canyon. Lyell thought that if we assume that these processes were always going on at the same rate, this being very rational and given to calculation, we can come up with a uniform explanation of things. In his book Principles of Geology, Lyell wrote, "No causes whatever have from the earliest time to which we can look back, to the present, ever acted but those now acting, and they have never acted with different degrees of energy from which they now exert." Of course, there is no proof of this. This is merely his hypothesis. Footnote: in 1831, a year after Lyell's Principles of Geology was published, Darwin read it during his voyage on the Beagle. After the voyage, Lyell became Darwin's mentor, and it is clear from Darwin's later statements that Lyell's ideas made him think of applying the principles of uniformitarianism to the past history of living creatures. In his private letters, Lyell made it clear that he was intent upon abolishing what he called mosaic geology, i.e., interpreting the geologic strata in terms of the Genesis flood. Henry M. Morris writes, "It is worth noting that neither Darwin nor Lyell were trained as scientists in the modern sense. Darwin was an apostate divinity student whose only degree was in theology. Charles Lyell was trained as a lawyer, not as a geologist. The leading geologists of his day, Cuvier, Buckland, for example, believed in catastrophism, and many of the geologists of our own day are now returning to that view. Lyell must have known that the actual data of geology predominantly favored catastrophism, not uniformitarianism. Yet he dogmatically insisted on long ages and uniformity, sarcastically rejecting the biblical chronology in the process." Morris, The Long War Against God, page 162. Stephen Jay Gould, one of today's leading evolutionists, has actually accused Lyell of deception in his promotion of this system. Lyell relied upon true bits of cunning to establish his uniformitarian view as the only true geology. Lyell imposed his imagination upon the evidence. Gould, Ever Since Darwin, pages 149 to 50. Return to text. This idea, together with the idea which was now gaining sympathy, that species evolve one into the other, led to another idea. If you put these two ideas together, you get the idea that most likely the world is not just a few thousand years old like the Christians seem to say, but that it must be very many thousands or millions of years old, or even more. Thus arose the idea of the greater and greater age of the earth. But again, this belief, that the world must be very old, was only a presupposition, it was not proved. Already this idea was sinking into the minds of men when in 1859 Charles Darwin came out with his book propounding the idea of natural selection. Darwin's idea was opposed to that of Lamarck, who said that the giraffe evolved because a short-necked creature stretched its neck to eat the higher leaves. Its offspring had a neck an inch longer, the next one stretched a little more, and gradually it became what we know today as a giraffe. This is against all scientific laws, because such things do not happen. An acquired characteristic cannot be inherited. For example, when Chinese women had their feet bound, their daughters were always born with normal feet. Darwin, on the other hand, came up with the idea that there were perhaps two longer-necked creatures which survived because they had longer necks. They were joined together because all the rest died off due to adverse circumstances or disaster, and their offspring did have longer necks because a change had occurred within them, what scientists today call a mutation. This might have been a chance thing at first, but once reproduction between two such creatures has taken place, it continues down through the ages. Of course, this is a guess because no one has observed such a thing happen. But this guess struck the consciousness of the people. They were like tinder, all ready for it, and this was the spark. The idea sounded so plausible, and the idea of evolution took hold, not because it was proved. As a matter of fact, the speculations of Darwin were based almost entirely upon his observations, not of evolution, but of variation. When he was traveling in the Galapagos Islands, Darwin wondered why there were 13 different varieties of one kind of finch, and thought that it was because there was one original variety which had developed according to its environment. This is not evolution but variation. From this, he jumped to the conclusion that if you keep making small changes like that, eventually you will have an absolutely different kind of creature. The problem in trying to prove this scientifically is that no one has ever observed these larger changes. they have only observed changes within a kind. Footnote. This is because, as has now been shown through genetic research, the capacity for variation of a particular organism is limited by the inherent variability of that organism's gene pool. In other words, writes Philip E. Johnson, the reason that dogs don't become as big as elephants, much less change into elephants, is not that we just haven't been breeding them long enough. Dogs do not have the genetic capacity for that degree of change, and they stop getting bigger when the genetic limit is reached. Darwin on Trial, page 18. Return to text. 3. Proofs of evolution. Let us look now at the so-called proofs of evolution to see what they are. We are not going to try to disprove, but just to try to see the quality of the proofs that are used, what it is that seems convincing to people who believe in evolution. 1. There is a standard textbook of zoology used 20 years ago, General Zoology by Tracy I. Storer, which lists a number of proofs. The first proof in the book is called comparative morphology, that is, a comparison of body structures. Man has arms, birds have wings, fish have flippers. The book has convincing diagrams which make them look very much alike. The birds have claws and we have fingers. The book shows how one might have developed into the other. Footnote. In this illustration, on page 215 of General Zoology, a hypothetical intermediate, referred to as such in the caption, is shown between the fin of a fish and the limb of an amphibian. In other words, in the absence of an intermediate species, the author had to invent one. Return to text. All creatures are shown to have a very similar structure, and the different structures are arranged according to different phyla and genera. Of course, this is not a proof. It is very logical, however, to one who believes in evolution. On the other hand, the scientific creationists say that if you believe that God created the universe, he must have had a basic master plan of creation. Therefore, all kinds of creatures would have basic similarities. If you believe that God created all the creatures, these diagrams convince you that, yes, God created them according to a plan. If you believe that one creature evolved into the other, you look at the same diagrams and say, yes, one evolved into the other. But there is no proof either for or against evolution in this. In actual fact, people accept evolution on some other basis and then look at such diagrams, and the diagrams convince them even more. 2. Secondly, there is comparative physiology. The book General Zoology states, the tissue and fluids of organisms show many basic similarities in physiological and chemical properties that parallel morphological features. For example, from the hemoglobin in vertebrate blood, oxyhemoglobin crystals can be obtained. Their crystalline structure parallels that of vertebrate classification based on body structure. Those of each species are distinct, but all from a genus have some common characteristic. Furthermore, those of all birds have certain resemblances but differ from crystals obtained from blood of mammals or reptiles. We can say the same thing here as we said of morphology. If you believe in creation, you say that God made similar creatures with similar blood, and there is no problem. If you believe in evolution, you say that one evolved into the other. A dating system has been devised from precipitations from blood. Scientists see that the precipitations are similar in each species, that they have something in common within one genus, and that they are quite distinct in different genera. Birds and monkeys, for example. From this they make certain calculations and decide how many years apart on the evolutionary scale these different creatures are. As it happens, their calculations throw everything else off. If this is to be accepted, other dating systems have to be changed, so it is still controversial. It actually proves nothing, because you can accept it as a proof either of evolution or of God's creation. 3. There is a third argument called comparative embryology. Textbooks like General Zoology used to have pictures that show an embryonic fish, salamander, turtle, chicken, pig, man, etc., demonstrating that they all look very much alike and saying that they gradually develop differently. You can see that man has so-called gill slits in the embryo. Therefore, this is supposed to be a remembrance of his ancestry. Footnote. That is, a proof that man evolved from aquatic animals with gills. Return to text. Ernst Haeckel, in his theory of recapitulation and biogenetic law, stated that an individual organism in its development ontogeny tends to recapitulate the stages passed through by its ancestors, phylogeny. Today this theory is no longer accepted by evolutionists. Scientists have found that the gill slits are not gill slits at all, but are just preparing for what is to be developed in the neck of the human being. So this proof has been pretty well discarded. Again, they use the argument that similarity means proof, which in fact it does not. For another proof, which used to be more powerful than it is today, is that of vestigial organs. Evolutionists claim that there are certain organs, like the appendix in man, which seem to have no function now, and therefore must be left over from a previous stage of evolution, when a monkey or another of man's ancestors used these organs. But more and more these vestigial organs are found to have a certain use. The appendix, for example, is found to have some kind of glandular function, so this argument is also losing weight. Footnote: practically all the so-called vestigial organs, especially those in man, have been proved in recent years to have definite uses and not to be vestigial at all. One time, evolutionists claimed there were about 180 such vestigial organs in man, but practically none are claimed now. Some of these were the thyroid gland, the thymus, the coccyx, the pineal gland, the ear muscles, the tonsils, and the appendix. All of these are now known to have useful, and often essential functions. Henry Mortis, Scientific Creationism, page 76. For a detailed treatment of this subject, see the book Vestigial Organs Are Fully Functional by Dr. Jerry Bergman and Dr. George Howe. Return to text. And just because we do not know what a certain organ does, this does not mean that it is left over from some lower form of life. 5. Then there are the arguments from paleontology, the study of fossils. Of course, the first seemingly convincing proof is the geological strata, as, for example, in the Grand Canyon where you see all kinds of strata, and the lower you get the more primitive the creatures there seem to be. Scientists date the strata by what kind of creatures are found in them. In the 19th century they discovered these strata and determined which were older and which were younger, and now they have a rather elaborate system by which to tell which strata are older and which are younger. Footnote: the geological column, scheme devised by evolutionists, with dates assigned to each stratum, is nowhere to be found in nature as a complete set of sediments of standard thickness. It is an imaginary structure that has been synthesized from comparing a stratum of rock in one part of the world with a similar-looking stratum in another part of the world. See Richard Milton, Shattering the Myths of Darwinism, CHS 3:7. Return to text. However, the whole dating system is rather circular. Since often these strata are upside down, according to the evolutionary model, they have to make certain readjustments. Footnote: the Encyclopedia Britannica, 11th edition, admits that in some fields all the strata are exactly upside down. I.e., primitive creatures are found at a higher level than more highly evolved ones. Return to text. Just like the Ptolemaic system needed certain adjustments, epicycles had to be devised because the planets were not going around the Earth uniformly. In the same way, evolutionists must make adjustments when they find that, according to evolutionary theory, the strata are upside down. They have to date them by the fossils in them. But how do they know that fossils in them are in the right order? They know because somewhere else the fossils were in the right order according to the evolutionist model, and they got the system from that. If you look at it closely, you see that it is a circular system. One has to have faith that this actually corresponds to reality. There are a number of flaws in this. For one thing, the creatures appear quite suddenly in each strata, with no intermediary types leading up to them. Besides this, as research continues, they are finding animals in the strata which are not supposed to be where they are. For example, now in the Precambrian level they are finding squid-like creatures, Tribrachidia, and all kinds of quite complex animals like that, which should not be there because they supposedly did not evolve until some 100 million years later. Either you have to change your idea of the evolution of such creatures, or you have to say that these were exceptions. In general, there is no proof that these strata were laid down over millions of years. Footnote: the uniformitarian assumption that the strata were laid down gradually over millions of years is not borne out by the evidence. Modern geological processes show that nowhere today are there rocks being formed anything like those in the existing strata. This points to a catastrophic origin of the strata. See Richard Milton, Shattering the Myths of Darwinism, pages 72 to 79, and Henry Morris, Scientific Creationism, pages 101, 11. Return to text. The creationists who talk about the flood of Noah say that it is equally conceivable that the flood caused exactly the same thing. The simpler marine animals on the sea bottoms would generally be the first to be buried, followed by fish and other organisms living nearer the ocean surface. The more advanced animals, including man, would be going on higher ground trying to get away from the flood. There would be few remnants of man, because man would be trying to get on ships and other things to get away. Footnote: Dr. Henry Morris says further, the fact that, although this order is generally to be expected, it is found to have many exceptions, both in terms of omissions and inversions, is also certainly to be expected in terms of deluge events, but is extremely difficult to account for logically in terms of evolution and uniformity. The Genesis Flood, page 276. Dr. David M. Ropp, curator of geology at Chicago's Field Museum of Natural History, which houses the world's largest collection of fossils, has made extensive studies of these fossil sequences and has come to the following conclusion. In the years after Darwin, his advocates hoped to find predictable progressions. In general, these have not been found, yet the optimism has died hard, and some pure fantasy has crept into the textbooks. Dr. Ropp, who is considered the world's greatest living paleontologist, is an evolutionist, but he acknowledges that one could fit just about any theory one likes to the fossil record. He says that the fossils could just as well have been deposited stochastically, randomly. As far as any order is concerned, David Ropp, Probabilistic Models in Evolutionary Paleobiology, American Scientist, January-February, 1977, page 57. He even notes the ironic implications of this for creationists. One of the ironies of the evolution-creation debate is that the creationists have accepted the mistaken notion that the fossil record shows a detailed and orderly progression, and they have gone to great lengths to accommodate this fact in their flood geology. David Ropp, Evolution and the Fossil Record, Science, July 17, 1981, page 289. In other words, writes Dr. Henry Morris, Ropp is saying that flood geologists need not bother to work out a flood model for the order of the fossils, since there isn't any order to accommodate. The Biblical Basis for Modern Science, page 363. Return to text. Moreover, there are only very particular conditions which cause a fossil to be left at all. A creature has to be buried suddenly in a certain kind of mud which allows it to be preserved. Footnote. Lu. To prevent decay by bacteria or assault by predators. Furthermore, this sediment must be of considerable depth to prevent the remains from being dispersed by natural processes. Richard Milton points out, today there are no known fossiliferous rocks forming anywhere in the world. There is no shortage of organic remains, no lack of quiet sedimentary marine environments. Indeed, there are the bones and shells of millions of creatures available on land and sea. But nowhere are these becoming slowly buried in sediments and lithified. They are simply being eroded by wind, tide, weather, and predators, shattering the myths of Darwinism, page 78. This indicates that the existing fossils were formed as a result of a great catastrophe. See Henry Morris, Scientific Creationism, pages 97 to 101. Return to text. The whole idea of the tagilness of these phenomena is being called more and more into question. There is now proof that oil and coal and such things can be made in an extremely short time, in a matter of days or weeks. Footnote. See John D. Morris, The Young Earth, pages 102 to 3. Return to text. The formation of fossils itself is very much in favor of some catastrophe. In the realm of paleontology, the most important argument against evolution is that it is hard to say that there has ever been found a single thing which can be called an intermediary species. In fact, Darwin was extremely worried about this. He wrote, "The number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed must be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this, perhaps, is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory. The explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geological record. Today's scientists say that the fossil record is extremely abundant. There are more fossil species known than living species. Still, there have not been found more than a couple which might be interpreted as somehow being an intermediary species. They will tell you about the pterodactyl, a reptile with wings, and say that this reptile is becoming a bird. But why can't you simply say this is a reptile with wings? Footnote. The animal that evolutionists most often cite as a reptile-to-bird transition is actually not the pterodactyl, but the Archaeopteryx. Philip E. Johnson calls the Archaeopteryx an odd variant, like the contemporary duck-billed platypus, Darwin on Trial, page 80. Henry Morris points out that it is a mosaic form, which possessed no transitional structures, The Biblical Basis for Modern Science, page 341. And even the evolutionists Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldridge acknowledge that, Curious mosaics like Archaeopteryx do not count as smooth intermediates in the fossil record. Paleobiology, Volume 3, Spring 1977, page 147. Michael Denton notes that there is no question that this archaic bird is not led up by a series of transitional forms from an ordinary terrestrial reptile through a number of gliding types with increasingly developed feathers until the avian condition is reached. Evolution. A Theory in Crisis, page 176. Return to text. There are certain fossils called index fossils which, when seen in a certain stratum, determine that that stratum cannot be any older or younger than a certain date, because that animal supposedly became extinct at a certain period. They found a fish *** swimming around in the ocean, which was supposed to be extinct 70 million years ago. Footnote 1. The coelacanth, which was discovered in 1938 off the coast of Madagascar. The coelacanth was thought to be closely related to the immediate ancestors of the amphibians. When it was dissected, however, its internal organs showed no signs of being pre-adapted for a land environment, and gave no indication of how it might be possible for a fish to become an amphibian. Johnson, Darwin on Trial, pages 76 to 77. See also Denton, pages 157, 179 to 80. Footnote 2. Lu. At about the same time that dinosaurs were supposed to have become extinct. Return to text. Because it was thought to be an index fossil, it threw off the whole thing, and that particular layer which was dated according to this extinct fish was no longer correct. Footnote. There are many other organisms whose fossils had been found only in strata thought to be hundreds of millions of years old, and which were thus used as index fossils, until they were found still living in modern times. For a partial list of these organisms, see Scientific Creationism, pages 88 to 89. Return to text. Why is it that certain species evolve and others stay the same as they were? There are many species found in the ancient strata which are exactly the same as currently living species. Evolutionists have ideas that some are reprobate species that do not go anywhere for some reason, and others are more progressive species, since they have the energy to go forward. But that is faith, not proof. The fossil species which have been preserved are just as distinct from each other as are living species. 6. Then there are the obvious family proofs of evolution. In most textbooks of evolution, there are artistic renderings tracing the evolution of the horse and the elephant. There is a great deal of subjectivity involved in this, just as when artists make the Neanderthal man look bent over to resemble an ape. This is not scientific proof, but imagination based on one's philosophical idea. There is quite a bit of evidence in the fossil record, which is either against evolution or shows that there is no proof one way or the other, and there are some things which are quite remarkable and are unable to be explained by evolution. The few clear lines of descent, the horse, pig, etc., involve either variation within a type, as evidently different sizes of horses, or else, when it involves apparently different kinds of creatures, merely assumes, but cannot prove, that one creature is related to another by direct descent. Footnote. A recent article in World Magazine, July 17, 1999, has noted concerning probably the best known of these alleged lines of descent. The Field Museum of Chicago is the source of that oft-reprinted exhibit purportedly showing the evolution of the horse. Little skeletons are followed by slightly larger and ever more equine skeletons, smoothly mutating until we have the modern-day horse. On the face of it, this seems to provide a vivid visual proof of evolution, with no missing links from the tiny ferret-like creature to the magnificent stallion, and it has been used as such in countless science textbooks. It turns out, though, that the animals whose skeletons are so arranged have nothing to do with each other. They represent different species, different branches, and overlapping times, as even evolutionists, called on the matter by critics of Darwinism, have been forced to admit. The Field Museum, to its credit, has pulled the showcase, substituting a photo of the old exhibit, along with an account of the controversy, Jean Edward Veith, admitting its mistakes. On the supposed lines of descent, see also Denton, pages 182 to 86, 191, and Milton, pages 102-5. Return to text. If evolution is true, these lines of descent may be plausible, but in no way do they constitute proof for evolution. 7. The final so-called proof of evolution is mutations. As a matter of fact, the serious scientist will tell you that all the rest is not really proof, but the one proof is mutations. There are some evolutionists, such as Theodosius Dobzhansky, who say, I have proved evolution because I have made a new species in the laboratory. After 30 years of working on fruit flies, which multiply very quickly, you can get the generational equivalent of several 100,000 years of human life in a few decades. Dobzhansky experimented by irradiating fruit flies and finally came up with two which had changes, and which no longer interbred with the other kind of fruit fly. This is his definition of species, that they do not interbreed. Therefore, he said, I have evolved a new species. In the first place, this was done under extremely artificial conditions with radiation, and you have to come up with a new theory of radioactive waves from outer space in order to justify it. Secondly, it is still a fruit fly. So it has no wings, or it is purple instead of yellow. It is still a fruit fly and is basically no different from any other fruit fly. It is simply another variety. So he has actually proved nothing. Footnote. Philip E. Johnson notes that an experimenter can greatly increase or decrease the number of bristles in a fruit fly, or greatly reduce the wing size, etc., but the fruit flies are still fruit flies, usually maladapted ones. Some accounts credit the fruit fly experiments with producing new species, in the sense of populations which do not interbreed with each other. Others dispute that the species border has in reality been crossed. Apparently the question turns on how narrowly or broadly one defines a species, especially with respect to populations that are inhibited from interbreeding, but not totally incapable of it. I am not interested in pursuing the question, because what is at issue here is the capacity to create new organs and organisms by this method, not the capacity to produce separated breeding populations. In any case, there is no reason to believe that the kind of selection used in the fruit fly experiments has anything to do with how fruit flies developed in the first place. Darwin on Trial, page 175. For a summary of the different definitions of species proposed by evolutionists, see above, page 134n. Return to text. Furthermore, mutations are 99% harmful. All experiments, including those by evolutionists who have worked on them for many decades, have proved unsuccessful in showing any real change from one kind of creature to another, even the most primitive kind that reproduces itself every 10 days. If anything, the evidence in that sphere is for the fixity of species. Footnote. As genetics expert Dr. Lee Spetner has observed, if random mutations could account for evolution of life, then they must have added a lot of information to the genome from the time of the first putative organism until the appearance of all present life. If this vast amount of information was built up by an accumulation of a long series of random mutations and natural selection, then each of these many billions of mutations must have, on the average, added some information. Yet after all the molecular studies that have been done on mutations, not a single one has been found that adds any genetic information. They all lose information. See Dr. Spetner's authoritative refutation of evolution, not by Chon. Return to text. But in the end, we have to say that there is no conclusive scientific proof for evolution, and likewise there is no conclusive proof against evolution, because even though it might not seem too logical or too plausible according to the evidence, still there is no proof that given a billion or trillion years a monkey might not be produced from an amoeba. Who knows? If you don't consider for a moment what the Holy Fathers say, you might think that perhaps it's true, especially if there is a God. If you think it happened by chance, you have no argument at all. Footnote. In saying by chance, Father Seraphim means without design, or without an intelligent designer. According to the neo-Darwinian modern synthetic theory of evolution, the fundamental mechanism of evolution is chance mutation, acting together with natural selection. Return to text. To believe it happened by chance requires much more faith than to believe in God. In any case, the evidence we have just examined will make sense to you according to what your philosophy is. The creationist philosophy requires less adjustment of the evidence, and so it is more in accordance with the simplistic presuppositions of modern science. 8. There is one more thing that has been used as a kind of proof of evolution, and that is radiometric dating. Radiocarbon, potassium argon, uranium decay, and so on. Footnote. The uranium decay system is the first radiometric method used historically, the method against which others have been calibrated, and the main support for the widely accepted idea that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. Return to text. These were all discovered in the present century, some of them just recently. Evolutionists say these systems prove the world is really very old. One textbook says they have brought about a revolution in dating, because before we had only relative ideas of age, and now we have absolute ideas. One can test a certain rock according to the potassium-argon system, and come up with the idea that the rock is 2 billion years old. They allow a margin of error of about 10%. The fact of the matter is that the great age of the Earth was supposedly already known by scientists long before these dating systems were developed. From their inception, the dating systems were based on unproven uniformitarian presuppositions of Charles Lyell, that the world was many millions, if not billions of years old. As William B. N. Barry writes in his book Growth of a Prehistoric Time Scale, evolution thus is the very basis of the geologic time scale, although the scale itself was erected before Darwin and Wallace presented their system of natural selection to the scientific world. It is all dependent on your philosophy. The radiometric dating systems work only if you already know that the world is millions of years old. Footnote: it must be remembered that, scientifically speaking, no one has proof for any dates prior to the beginning of written records, about 4,000 to 6,000 years ago at most. Dates prior to the beginning of history must necessarily be based on the assumption of uniformitarianism. Henry Morris, Scientific Creationism, page 150. Return to text. Thus, they are not really revolutionary in dating. They simply fit into an already accepted view. If these new dating systems had said that the world was only 5,000 years old, instead of 3 billion, scientists would not have accepted them so easily. Footnote: as Richard Milton observes, science has proposed many methods of geochronometry, measuring the Earth's age, all of which are subject to some uncertainties, e.g., efflux of helium into the atmosphere, influx of salt to the ocean. But of these many methods, only one technique, that of the radioactive decay of uranium and similar elements, yields an age for the Earth of billions of years. And it is this one method that has been enthusiastically promoted by Darwinists and uniformitarian geologists, while all other methods have been neglected. Shattering the Myths of Darwinism, page 38. Return to text. The geological column and approximate ages of all the fossil-bearing strata were also worked out according to evolutionary theory long before radiometric dating was ever heard of. Footnote: for example, in the 19th century Charles Lyell attempted to date the end of the Cretaceous period by reference to how long he thought it would have taken the shellfish, whose fossils are found in later beds, to have evolved into their modern descendants. Lyell estimated that the Cretaceous ended 80 million years ago, not far from today's accepted figure of 65 million, Shattering the Myths of Darwinism, page 22. Return to text. Any objective scientific book on the subject will tell you that the only way we can give absolute numbers of years to the different strata is by accepting the theory of evolution. Index fossils are used as the ultimate indication of the age of the strata, and the age of the index fossils is determined by evolutionary assumptions about them. Footnote: when different radiometric tests of a rock, performed according to one or more radiometric procedures, come up with discordant ages, as frequently happens, evolutionists will decide upon an age that accords with their ideas of the evolutionary stages of index fossils found in the same bed. As Dr. John D. Morris puts it, once again the fossils date the rocks, and the fossils are dated by evolution. One famous case of this was the dating controversy over the KNM-ER 1470 skull discovered by Richard Leakey, which is discussed in Appendix 4. See also Lubnow, Bones of Contention, pages 247 to 288, and Milton, pages 53 to 56. Return to text. As the American Journal of Science states, the only chronometric scale applicable in geologic history for the stratigraphic classification of rocks and for dating geologic events exactly is furnished by the fossils. Owing to the irreversibility of evolution, they offer an unambiguous time scale for relative age determinations and for worldwide correlation of rocks. Footnote: likewise W. M. Elasser of the University of Maryland writes, as is well known, the order of the geological strata is fixed entirely by means of fossils. Thus, the geological method presumes the existence in these periods of living beings of gradually increasing complexity. Encyclopaedia Britannica, 1973, Volume 7, page 850. J. E. O'Rourke, writing in the American Journal of Science, January 1976, page 53, states, the intelligent layman has long suspected circular reasoning in the use of rocks to date fossils and fossils to date rocks. The geologist has never bothered to think of a good reply, feeling that explanations are not worth the trouble as long as the work brings results. This is supposed to be hard-headed pragmatism. Return to text. Therefore, it's another circular argument. The theory of evolution is not proved by the millions of years, because the millions of years rely upon the theory of evolution. If evolution is not true, there is no need for the millions of years. Secondly, there are certain basic assumptions which the radiometric dating systems must make. The systems which trace the decay rate of radioactive minerals to daughter components require 1. That there is absolute uniformity, that the decay rate has always been the same for as long as the process has been going on. 2. That there has been no contamination from outside sources, which they admit does happen. 3. That the thing being dated has been isolated, buried somewhere, and no organic matter has been touching it from outside. And finally, 4. That there was none of the daughter component in the first place, but only the parent component. All these things are assumptions, they are not proved. The evolutionist William B. N. Barry writes of the unproven uniformitarian assumptions on which radiometric dating systems, and indeed all aspects of evolutionist geology and paleontology, rely. All phenomena that are related to the past history of the Earth are dependent upon the principle of uniformity in nature's processes through time for their interpretation. Everything from interpreting shells preserved in rocks as remains of once living organisms to ascertaining the passage of time by using decay rates of unstable isotopes such as potassium-40 and carbon-14 depends on this principle. For example, the carbon-14 method depends on this principle as expressed in the assumptions that cosmic radiation has been of the same intensity for at least the last 35,000 years, the length of time for which this method is most effective, and that the decay rate of carbon-14 has always been the same as it is now. Obviously, without a principle of uniformity in natural processes, age determinations based on carbon-14 decay could not even be considered. Many people, even among non-evolutionists, will admit that carbon-14 is the most reliable of all the dating systems. Even the scientific creationists admit that it has a fair accuracy back perhaps 3,000 years, although with considerable scatter and uncertainty. Footnote: Henry M. Morris, Scientific Creationism, page 162. The reasons why radiocarbon dating has some accuracy up to 3,000 years ago, but not before, are explained on pages 164 to 67. See also John D. Morris, The Young Earth, pages 64-67. Return to text. It has been tested on certain articles whose age has been determined, and it has proved to be not too far off in many cases. But beyond 2,000 or 3,000 years it becomes extremely dubious. Even those who are adherents to this system admit that, because the half-life of carbon-14 is 5,600 years or so, it cannot be accurate beyond 25,000 or 35,000 years at the most. The other systems, such as potassium-argon, uranium decay, etc., claim to measure a half-life of 1.3 and 4.5 billion years respectively, and therefore when they talk about proving the age of old rocks, they are using these systems. The carbon-14 system is used only on organic matter, and potassium-argon and uranium systems are used on rocks. Footnote: radioisotope methods cannot be applied to fossils themselves, nor to the sedimentary rock containing the fossils, but only to igneous rocks which may lie above or below the fossil-bearing stratum. Return to text. The same things are true for the latter as they are for the former. There must be uniformity throughout the billions of years, and no contamination from outside. In the potassium-argon method, for example, you must assume that it was all potassium-40 in the beginning before it decayed to argon-40, and all these things you have to take on faith. If you try to measure anything recent, say only 1 million years ago, and use this system with a half-life of over 1 billion years, it is like trying to measure a millimeter with a yardstick. It is not very accurate even assuming it is valid. Footnote: this is a big assumption. Argon-40 is a very common isotope in the atmosphere and the rocks of the Earth's crust. Indeed, argon is the 12th most abundant chemical element on Earth, and more than 99% of it is argon-40. There is no physical or chemical way to tell whether any given sample of argon-40 is the residue of radioactive decay or was present in the rocks when they were formed. Milton, page 47. That argon-40 was present in potassium minerals at the time of their formation is evidenced by the spectacularly erroneous dates which the potassium-argon method gives to recently formed rocks of known age, see below. Return to text. There have been numerous cases when they have applied this system to new rocks and have come up with ages of millions or billion years. Footnote. For example, the Hawaiian Institute of Geophysics used the potassium-argon method to date volcanic rocks near Waialae, Hawaii, and got ages of up to 3 billion years, when the rocks are known to have been formed in a modern eruption in 1801. Similar rocks formed less than 200 years ago from an active volcano, Kilauea, were found to give potassium-argon ages of up to 22 million years. 50-year-old lava flows at Mtngoroho, New Zealand, produced model ages as high as 3.5 million years. See Milton, pages 38, 47-48. Return to text. Therefore, the whole thing is very shaky. It requires that those billions of years exist in the first place. Footnote. Dr. John D. Morris explains that radiometric dating, in this case the uranium decay method, is based on the assumption that the Earth is at least old enough for the present amount of radiogenic lead, i.e., the daughter component, in a specimen to have been produced by present rates of uranium decay. If we knew that the Earth was old, the possibility exists that radioisotope dating could help to determine exactly how old, but it is useless in testing between old Earth and young Earth. It assumes the old Earth, John D. Morris, the young Earth, page 57. Return to text. There are other kinds of tests which have been used at various times as, for example, the rate at which sodium and various chemicals are discharged into the ocean. You measure the amount of the elements there are now in the ocean, measure approximately how much of it goes into the sea every year, and from that you come up with a guess of how old the ocean must be. And probably the ocean is as old as the world. They did this with sodium and discovered the world was 100 million years old. But it was found that you get different answers depending on which element you use. Lead gives an age of 2,000 years, others give 8,000 years, some 100 years, some 50 million. There is absolutely no uniformity. There are other tests. For example, a test was done based on the rate at which helium-4 is entering the atmosphere through the corona of the Sun. This indicated that the atmosphere of the Earth is but several thousand years old. Therefore, these tests are very unsure, and some of them make it very dubious that the world could be anything like 5 billion years old. When you come down to it, it depends what your faith is. Some scientists think the Earth is very old because evolution is unthinkable unless the Earth is very old. If you believe in evolution, you must believe the Earth is very old, since it is obvious that evolution does not work on a short time scale. But as far as scientific proof goes, there is none whatsoever that the Earth is 5 billion years old, or 7,500 years old. It could be either. It depends on what kind of suppositions you start with. For the theory of evolution is understandable philosophically. So evolution is not, in fact, a scientific problem. It is a philosophical question. We have to realize that the theory of evolution is acceptable to certain scientists, philosophers, and other people because they have been prepared for it. Let us look now at its philosophical antecedents in the apostasy of Western society from traditional Christianity. Footnote. Some of the following discussion in this section has been taken from previous lectures of Father Seraphim's survival course. Return to text. As we have seen, the idea of evolution arose at the end of the 18th century, which was the end of the Enlightenment and the beginning of the revolutionary age, our own age. The Enlightenment was characterized by a stable worldview, but that stability could not last. It had to give way to the evolutionary worldview. We will discuss later why this was so. One of the classical works on the Enlightenment, The European Mind by Paul Hazard, states, "In this period, a moral clash took place in Europe. The interval between the Renaissance, of which it is a lineal descendant, and the French Revolution, for which it was forging the weapons, constitutes an epoch which yields to none in historical importance. Degree. The Enlightenment was the classical age of modern Europe. This period between the Renaissance and modern times was the first real attempt to make a harmonious synthesis of the new forces let loose by the Middle Ages, Renaissance, and Reformation, without losing the spiritual base of some kind of Christianity." Footnote. Father Seraphim showed in a previous lecture that, after the schism of the Western Church from the Orthodox Church, the Western tendency toward rationalism went unchecked. This was seen almost immediately after the schism with the rise of scholasticism, in which reason was exalted above faith and tradition. Return to text. The first aspect of this new classical age, this new harmony, was the dominance of the scientific worldview, which took the form of the world machine of Isaac Newton. Footnote: Sir Isaac Newton, 1642 to 1727, was a theist who believed in Jesus Christ, but was racked with anxieties about the rationality of Christianity. Like other Enlightenment thinkers such as Thomas Jefferson, he committed himself to saving Christianity by rewriting the Bible and purging it of what he called the corruptions, that is, the miraculous events. He rejected the doctrine of the Trinity. Cf. Ian T. Taylor, J. and the Minds of Men, pages 342 to 43. Return to text. The Age of Newton, the early Enlightenment, was a time when science and rational religion seemed to agree that all was right with the world, and the arts flourished in a way in which they were never again to flourish in the West. Before this time, the West had known several centuries of intellectual ferment and even chaos as the medieval Roman Catholic synthesis collapsed and new forces made themselves felt, leading to heated disputes and bloody warfare. The religious wars for all practical purposes ended with the close of the 30 Years' War in 1648, which devastated Germany. Protestantism had rebelled against a complexity and corruption in Catholicism. There was a renaissance in ancient pagan thought and art. A new humanism had discovered the natural man, which pushed the idea of God ever more into the background. And more significant for the future, science replaced theology as the standard of knowledge, and the study of nature and its laws came to seem the most important intellectual pursuit. By the 17th and early 18th centuries, however, a certain equilibrium and harmony were reached in Western thought. Christianity was not, after all, overthrown by the new ideas, but rather adapted itself to the new spirit, and the difficulties and contradictions of modern naturalistic and rationalistic ideas had not yet made themselves felt. Particularly in the most enlightened part of Western Europe, England, France, and Germany, it almost seemed that a golden age had come, especially in contrast with the religious wars which had ravaged these countries up to the middle of the 17th century. The enlightened man believed in God whose existence could be rationally demonstrated, was tolerant of the beliefs of others, and was convinced that everything in the world could be explained by modern science whose latest advances he eagerly followed. The world seemed to be a vast machine in perpetual motion, whose every movement could be described mathematically. It was one great harmonious universe, ordered as a uniform mathematical system. The classical work expressing these ideas, Newton's Principia Mathematica, was greeted with universal acclaim when it appeared in 1687, showing that the educated world at that time was thoroughly ripe for this new gospel. In the new synthesis of the Enlightenment, nature replaced God as the central idea, even though God was not thrown out until the very end of this period. The age of the Newtonian system was also the age of the religion of reason. Religion was now subjected to the same standard as was science, to the study of the outward world, that is, the standard of reason. Thus continued the process which had begun with scholasticism soon after the schism, when reason was placed above faith and tradition. The Enlightenment was the time when men dreamed of a religion of reasonableness. In terms of religion, deism was perhaps the most typical movement of the 18th century. The idea of deism is that God exists, but he's quite irrelevant, that is, he creates the world and steps back. Newton himself believed that he could not calculate quite everything correctly, as for instance the paths of comets. He had the idea that the universe was like a great watch which God made, and then stepped back, and that once in a while he had to step in and correct it, wind it up again. But later astronomers said that no, this is not true. One can actually have a unified theory which explains everything including all irregular movements, and so God is necessary only at the beginning. God becomes extremely vague. Thus miracles and prophecy began to be called into question, and many writers already began to say that they were just superstition. In this the French becomes more radical than the English. Looking at the Enlightenment worldview, one can see what a harmonious idea it appeared to be, of nature ruling over everything, the mysteries of nature being discovered, God still being in heaven, although not doing much, and scientific knowledge progressing over the whole world. This brings us to the second main aspect of the Enlightenment, which was a faith in human progress. In his book The Making of the Modern Mind, J. H. Randall, Jr. writes, "It was from the spread of reason and science among individual men that the great apostles of the Enlightenment hoped to bring about the ideal society of mankind. And from there they hoped for a veritable millennium. From the beginning of the 18th century onward there arose one increasing paean of progress through education. Locke, Helvetius, and Bentham laid the foundations for this generous dream, all men of whatever school, save only those who clung to the Christian doctrine of original sin, believed with all their ardent natures in the perfectibility of the human race. At last mankind held in its own hands the key to its destiny. It could make the future almost what it would. By destroying the foolish errors of the past and returning to a rational cultivation of nature, there were scarcely any limits to human welfare that might not be transcended. It is difficult for us to realize how recent a thing is this faith in human progress. The ancient world seems to have had no conception of it. Greeks and Romans looked back rather to the golden age from which man had degenerated. The Middle Ages, of course, could brook no such thought. The Renaissance, which actually accomplished so much, could not imagine that man could ever rise again to the level of glorious antiquity. Its thoughts were all on the past. Only with the growth of science in the 17th century could men dare to cherish such an overweening ambition. All the scientists, from Descartes down, despised the ancients and carried the day for the faith in progress. Why did the Enlightenment worldview collapse? Its philosophy now seems hopelessly naive, its art a golden age impossible to revive. There are several causes, and they all overlap each other. The most fundamental cause is the critical approach of the very rationalism upon which the whole Enlightenment worldview was based. The Holy Fathers say that human reason has been corrupted since the fall of man. Therefore, it must be submitted to faith and revelation, and thus raised up to a higher level. Once reason is exalted above faith and tradition, its critical approach produces its own destruction. The faith in human reason that first produced scholasticism, then produced the Reformation, because reason criticized religion itself. The Reformation was a criticism of medieval Catholicism, and then a criticism of Protestantism produced the atheist/agnostic philosophers of the 19th century. Finally, the critical approach of reason produced the actual suicide of reason. Once one trusts reason as the standard of truth, one must follow it all the way on its destructive course. One has no argument against it. Since the Middle Ages, rationalism had reduced the sphere of knowledge as it criticized every tradition and the reality of the spiritual world, everything except the outward world. With the English philosopher David Hume in the latter part of the 18th century, autonomous reason finally went as far as it could go. It destroyed all certain knowledge, even of the outward world. Hume said we cannot know absolute truth through our reason. We can only know what we experience. He wrote, "Reason is a subjective faculty, which has no necessary relation with the facts we seek to know. It is limited to tracing the relations of our ideas, which themselves are already twice removed from reality. And our senses are equally subjective, for they can never know the thing in itself, but only an image of it which has in it no element of necessity and certainty. The contrary of every matter of fact is still possible." This, in fact, is a very deep thing in our modern thinkers of the last 200 years. This despair at never being able to know anything, underscore which dissolves the very fabric of life. Believe in rationalistic philosophy and start thinking things through, and you come against Hume and other thinkers like him, and suddenly the whole world dissolves. Thus, with justice, one writer on the philosophy of the Enlightenment has the following thing to say about Hume. To read Hume's dialogues after having read with sympathetic understanding the earnest deists and optimistic philosophers of the early part of the 18th century, is to experience a slight chill, a feeling of apprehension. It is as if at the high noon of the Enlightenment, at the hour of the siesta when everything seems to be quiet and secure all about, one was suddenly aware of the short, sharp slipping of the foundations, a faint far-off tremor running under the solid ground of common sense. This, of course, later produced the great earthquakes of our own times. The experimental ideal in science had a function similar to that of reason, in destroying the stability of the Enlightenment worldview. Being itself based in rationalism, this ideal is never satisfied. It never stops, but always waits to test its conclusions and come to new ones. That is why scientific ideas are constantly changing, and why the scientific synthesis at the time of Newton was overthrown. Finally, the idea of progress helped to dissolve the old synthesis. In the Renaissance, as we have seen, the ancients were looked to as the true standard. It was thought that, if only we could get back to them and away from the Middle Ages and superstition, we would be fine. Then when the sciences became the dominant mode of thought, the scientific worldview arose. People began to see that anyone living today has more scientific knowledge than anyone living in antiquity. Now science for the first time has moved forward dramatically with its experiments, etc. The very idea of progress, that the present is building upon the past, that the future generations will improve upon us, and that man will go constantly ahead. This obviously obliterates the idea that there is one constant standard. Just as in Hume's subjectivism, everything becomes relative. One's existing standard is left to the fate of the future people who are going to improve upon it. After a while, people begin to realize that this is a philosophy of constant change, constant movement. Then the soul begins to be upset. It senses there is no peace, no security. By the end of the 18th century, this idea of progress had given birth to the evolutionary worldview, which was quite different from the stable worldview of Newton, and which rose to the fore in the 19th century. And so the 18th century began with great optimism, but most people did not realize that by the end of the century, the most advanced philosophers would destroy any possibility of any real knowledge of the external world and any constant standard of truth. It takes time for deep ideas like that to filter down to the people, but when they do, they produce disastrous effects. These disastrous effects were seen in the French Revolution of 1789, which was the revolutionary application of rationalistic ideas to the changing of society and the whole outward order of life. The end of the 18th century brought with it the end of the old order, the end of an age of stability when human institutions and art and culture were based on at least a remnant of Christianity and Christian feeling. The outbreak of the French Revolution coincided with the end of Christian civilization. Before 1789 it was still the old regime. After that, it is the age of revolution, our own times. In view of all this, the theory of evolution is understandable philosophically. It arose out of a search for a scientific law of progress to justify the modern revolutionary advance. The theory of evolution was first proposed by Charles Darwin's grandfather Erasmus in 1794, only 5 years after the French Revolution. Footnote: many of Erasmus Darwin's friends and associates were sympathizers with the French revolutionaries. Erasmus was a founder of the Lunar Society, which included these revolutionary sympathizers, and whose membership overlapped that of the Revolutionary Society, led by the radical Earl Stanhope. Erasmus especially admired Rousseau, the chief philosopher of the Revolution. He was also a Freemason, as was his son, Charles Darwin's father. Return to text. J. H. Randall, Jr., who is himself an evolutionist, is sophisticated enough to admit that the theory of evolution is a faith, not a proven fact. At present, biologists admit that we do not, strictly speaking, know anything about the causes of the origins of new species. We must fall back upon the scientific faith that they occur because of chemical changes in the germplasm. Footnote: a similar statement was made by a leading British evolutionary biologist, Professor L. Harrison Matthews, in a foreword to a 1971 edition of Darwin's Origin of Species. The fact of evolution is the backbone of biology, and biology is thus in the peculiar position of being a science founded on an unproven theory. Is it then a science or a faith? Belief in evolution is thus exactly parallel to belief in special creation. Both are concepts which believers know to be true, but neither, up to the present, has been capable of proof. Return to text. Evolutionists must fall back upon this faith because, as they say, anything else is unthinkable. The anything else being that God created the world 7,000 or 8,000 years ago. Randall continues, describing the effect of evolution on the world. In spite of these difficulties, the beliefs of men today have become thoroughly permeated with the concept of evolution. The great underlying notions and concepts that meant so much to the 18th century, nature and reason and utility, have largely given way to a new set better expressing the ultimate intellectual ideas of the growing world. Many social factors conspired to popularize the idea of development and its corollaries. Perhaps the fundamental emphasis brought by evolution into men's minds has been upon the detailed causal analysis of the specific processes of change. Instead of seeking to discover the end or purpose of the world process as a whole, or to discern the ultimate cause or ground of all existent things, the fundamental task of earlier science and philosophy, men have come to examine just what the process is and just what it does in its parts. They have rejected the contemplation of a fixed and static structure of truth, and adopted instead the aim of investigating all the little truths which experimentation can reveal. Not that truth which is the source of all truths, lifting man's soul above all human experiences to the realm of the eternal, but the patient, tireless, and endless search after an infinity of finite truths in our experience. This is the present-day goal of all scientific and philosophical endeavor. Randall mentions how the changing human institutions, the different ideas of morality, etc., enforce one's faith in evolution. The conception of man as an organism reacting to and acting upon a complex environment is now basic. Footnote: this is the basic tenet of the evolutionary worldview and the revolutionary age regarding human nature. It is built into the scientific philosophy of Darwinism and the political philosophy of Darwin's admirer Karl Marx, and it is common to all totalitarian and utopian schemes deriving from these two, including modern liberalism and radical feminism. Judge Robert H. Bork, in his book Slouching Towards Gomorrah, Modern Liberalism and American Decline, puts this evolutionary tenet succinctly as follows: human nature is infinitely malleable so that a new, better, and perhaps perfect human nature can be produced by the rearrangement of social institutions. Feminist Sheer Height, in the Height Report on the Family, expressed this belief when she said, "There is no such thing as a fixed human nature. Rather, it is a psychological structure that is carefully implanted in our minds as we learn the love and power equations of the family for life. Fortunately, the family is a human institution. Humans made it, and humans can change it." Return to text. All ideas and institutions are today thought of as primarily social products, functioning in social groups and springing from the necessity of effecting some kind of adaptation between human nature and its environment. All the fields of human interest today have undergone this general sociologizing and psychologizing tendency. The example of religion and theology will be a sufficient illustration. Whereas the 18th century thought of religion and theology as a deductive and demonstrative set of propositions, men now consider religion as primarily a social product, a way of life springing from the social organization of men's religious experiences, and theology as a rationalization of certain fundamental feelings and experiences of human nature. We no longer prove the existence of God, we talk of the meaning of God in human experience. We no longer demonstrate the future life, we investigate the effect of the belief in immortality upon human conduct. We see very clearly that this is the next stage beyond Hume, who destroyed all these things. You can no longer believe in those old ideas. This is the next stage, and it has nothing to do with the scientific discovery of evolution. It is simply what is in the air. Once reason continues its march, it will end in its own suicide. Randall continues, evolution has introduced a whole new scale of values. Where for the 18th century the ideal was the rational, the natural, even the primitive and unspoiled, for us the desirable is identified rather with the latter end of the process of development, and our terms of praise are modern, up-to-date, advanced, progressive. Just as much as the Enlightenment, we tend to identify what we approve with nature, but for us it is not the rational order of nature, but the culmination of an evolutionary process, which we take for our leverage in existence. The 18th century could think of nothing worse to call a man than an unnatural enthusiast. We prefer to dub him an antiquated and outgrown fossil. That age believed a theory if it were called rational, useful, and natural. We favor it if it is the most recent development. We had rather be modernists and progressives than sound reasoners. It is perhaps an open question if in our new scale of values we have not lost as much as we have gained. The idea of evolution, as it has finally come to be understood, has reinforced the humanistic and naturalistic attitude. 5. The conflict between Christian truth and evolutionary philosophy. Now we must look to see what orthodoxy says about the question of evolution, where it touches upon philosophy and theology. According to the theory of evolution, man is coming up from savagery, and that is why books show Cro-Magnon man, Neanderthal man, etc., looking very savage, ready to beat someone over the head and take his meat. This is obviously someone's imagination. It is not based upon the shape of the fossils or anything else. If you believe that man came up from savagery, you will interpret all past history in those terms. But according to orthodoxy, man fell from paradise. In evolutionary philosophy, there is no room for a supernatural state of Adam. Those who want to keep both Christianity and evolutionism, therefore, are forced to stick an artificial paradise onto an ape-like creature. These are obviously two different systems which cannot be mixed. What finally happens is that the people who do this, including many Catholics in recent decades, see that they have become mixed up and therefore they accept that evolution must be right and Christianity a myth. They begin to say that the fall of man is only a fall from cosmic immaturity, that when ape-like creatures, being in a state of naivete, evolved into human beings, they acquired a guilt complex, and that is the fall. Furthermore, they come to believe that originally there was not just one pair of human beings, but many. This is called polygenism, the idea that man came from many different pairs. Once you give in to the idea that Genesis and the origin of man must be inspected rationalistically, on the basis of the naturalistic philosophy of modern thinkers, then Christianity has to be put away. Naturalistic philosophy is a realm of relative truths. In the teaching of the Holy Fathers, on the other hand, we have truths which are revealed and are given to us by God-inspired men. In the writings of the Holy Fathers, there is a great deal of material about evolution, although one wouldn't think so. If one thinks through what evolution is philosophically and theologically, and then looks up those questions in the Holy Fathers, there is a great deal of information to be found. We cannot go into much of it right now, but we will cover a few points in order to characterize evolution according to patristic teaching. First, we should note that, according to the Holy Fathers, creation is something quite different from the world we see today. An entirely different principle is involved. This goes against the thinking of modern Christian evolutionists. One such evolutionist, the Greek theologian Panagiotis Trempelas, writes that it appears more glorious and divine-like and more in harmony with the regular methods of God, which we daily see expressed in nature to have come at the various forms by evolutionary methods. We will note here that oftentimes theologians are quite behind the times. In order to apologize for the scientific dogma, they often come up with things which the scientists have already left behind, because the scientists are reading the literature. The theologians often are scared that they are going to be old-fashioned or say something which is not in accordance with scientific opinion. So often they can quite unconsciously fall for an evolutionary idea by not thinking the whole thing through, by not having a thoroughgoing philosophy, and not being aware of scientific evidence and scientific questions. The idea that Panagiotis Trempelas sets forth, that creation is supposed to be in accordance with the methods which God uses all the time, has certainly nothing patristic about it, because creation is when the world came into being. Every Holy Father who writes about this will say that those first 6 days of creation were quite different from anything else that ever happened in the history of the world. Even Blessed Augustine says that the creation is a mystery. He says we really can't even talk about it because it's so different from our own experience. It's beyond us. We simply cannot project present-day laws of nature back into the past and come up with an understanding of the creation. Creation is something different. It's the beginning of all this, and nor the way it is now. Some rather naive theologians try to say that the 6 days of creation can be indefinitely long periods, that they can correspond to the different geological strata. This, of course, is nonsense because the geological strata do not have 6 easily identifiable layers, or 5 or 4 or anything of the sort. There are many, many layers, and they do not correspond at all to the 6 days of creation. So that is a very weak accommodation. As a matter of fact, even though it looks as though it might be terribly fundamentalistic to say it, the Holy Fathers do say that those days were 24 hours long. Saint Ephraim the Syrian even divides them into 2 periods, 12 hours each. Saint Basil the Great says that, in the book of Genesis, the first day is called not the first day, but one day, because that is the one day by which God measured out the entire rest of the creation. That is, this first day, which he says was 24 hours long, is exactly the same day which is repeated in the rest of creation. If you think about it, there is nothing particularly difficult in that idea, since the creation of God is something totally outside our present knowledge. The accommodation of days to epochs does not make any sense. You cannot fit them together. Therefore, why do you need to have a day that is 1,000 or 1,000,000 years long? Footnote. Some modern commentators, attempting to place the Genesis account within the evolutionary time scale, have tried in vain to show that the Holy Fathers believed the 6 days of creation to be vast ages. Those who have quoted St. John Damascene's mention of the 7 ages of the world for this purpose, on the Orthodox Faith 2:1, have misinterpreted his meaning. The idea that world history is comprised of 7 ages, corresponding to the 7 days of the creation week, is an ancient one, found even in pre-Christian times. See Damian Thompson, The End of Time, pages 7-29, and Francis Haber, The Age of the World, pages 19-21. But according to this idea, the 7 ages come after the creation week. Saint Simeon the New Theologian makes this clear in his discussion of the 6 days of creation and the 7th day of God's rest. God, as the foreknower of everything, arranged the whole creation in order and in an orderly sequence, and he assigned 7 days that they might be an image of the ages which were subsequently to pass in time. The first created man, pages 89-90, emphasis added. St. John Damascene's own writings make clear that when he speaks of the 7 ages, he is referring to world history after the creation week, for he says that the 7 ages of the present world include many ages in the sense of the generations of men, on the Orthodox faith 2:1. This becomes even more evident in a later chapter of the same work, in which he writes specifically about the 6 days of creation, showing that he regards the length of these days, even the first 3 days, before the sun was made, as corresponding to the length of solar days, 365 of which make up the 12 months of the sun, on the Orthodox faith 2:7. Return to text. The Holy Fathers say again with one voice that the creative acts of God are instantaneous. Saint Basil the Great, Saint Ambrose the Great, Saint Ephraim and many others say that, when God creates, he says the word and it is faster than thought. There are many patristic quotations about this, but we will not go into them here. None of the Holy Fathers say that the creation was slow. There are 6 days of creation, and they describe this not as a long process. The idea that man has been evolving from something lower is totally foreign to any Holy Fathers. Rather, they say that the lower creatures came first in order to prepare the realm for the higher creature who is man, who must have his kingdom already created before he comes. Saint Gregory the theologian says that man was made by God on the 6th day and entered into the newly created earth. There is a whole patristic teaching concerning the state of the world and of Adam before the fall. Adam was potentially immortal. As Blessed Augustine says, he was created with the possibility of being either mortal or immortal in the body, and he chose by his fall to be mortal in the body. The creation before the fall of Adam was in a different state. About this the Holy Fathers do not tell us very much. It is really beyond us. But certain Holy Fathers of the most contemplative sort, such as Saint Gregory the Sinite, do describe the state of paradise. Saint Gregory says that paradise exists now in the same state it was in then, but that it has become invisible to us. It is placed between corruption and incorruption, so that when a tree falls in paradise, it does not rot away like we see around us, but is turned into the most fragrant substance. This is a hint which tells us that paradise is beyond us, that some other law exists there. We know of people who have been to paradise, like Saint Euphrosyne the cook, who brought back 3 apples from there. These 3 apples were kept for a little while. The monks divided them up and ate them, and they were very sweet. The account says that they ate them like holy bread, which means this had something to do with matter, and yet it was something different from matter. Nowadays people are speculating about matter and antimatter, about what is the source or root of matter. They don't know anymore. So why should we be surprised that there is a different kind of matter? Footnote. Elsewhere Father Seraphim quoted Professor I.M. Andreev of Holy Trinity Seminary on how matter changed at the fall. Christianity has always viewed the present state of matter as being the result of a fall into sin. The fall of man changed the whole of nature, including the nature of matter itself, which was cursed by God. Genesis 3 verse 17. Andreev, Scientific Knowledge and Christian Truth, in St. Vladimir National Calendar for 1974, page 69. See also Vladimir Low-Sky, The Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church, pages 103-4. Return to text. We know also that there will be a different body, a spiritual body. Our resurrected body will be of a different kind of matter than we know now. Saint Gregory the Sinite says it will be like our present body, but without moisture and heaviness. What that is we do not know, because, unless one has seen an angel, one has not had experience of this. We do not have to speculate about exactly what kind of matter this is, because that will be revealed to us when we need to know it in the next life. It is enough for us to know that paradise, and the state of the whole creation before the fall of Adam, was quite different from what we know now. The law of nature we know now is the law of nature that God gave when Adam fell. That is, when he said, "Cursed be the earth for thy sake," Genesis 3 verse 17, and, "In pain thou shalt bring forth children," Genesis 3 verse 16. Adam brought death into the world, so it is very likely that no creature died before the fall. Before the fall, Eve was a virgin. God made male and female knowing man would fall, and would need this means of reproducing. There is an element of great mystery in the state of creation before the fall of Adam, which we do not need to pry into because we are not interested in the how of creation. We know that there was a creation of 6 days, and the Holy Fathers say they were 24-hour days. There is nothing surprising about this, that the acts were instantaneous. God wills and it is done, he speaks and it is done. Since we believe in God who is almighty, there is no problem whatsoever. but how it looked, how many kinds of creatures there were. For example, whether there were all the different kinds of cats we see, or whether there were 5 basic types. We don't know, and it's not important for us to know. Footnote. As Philip E. Johnson points out, the doctrine of creation scientists has always been that God created basic kinds, or types, which subsequently diversified. The most famous example of creationist microevolution involves the descendants of Adam and Eve, who have diversified from a common ancestral pair to create all the diverse races of the human species. Darwin on Trial, page 68. Return to text. To add to the theory of evolution the idea of God, as some Christian evolutionists do, gives no help at all. Or rather, it gives only one help. It gets you out of the problem of finding out where everything came from in the first place. Instead of a great tapioca bowl of cosmic jelly, you have God. That is more clear. It is a straight idea. If you have the tapioca jelly in space somewhere, it is very mystical and difficult to understand. If you are a materialist, it makes sense to you, but that is purely on the basis of your prejudices. But apart from this, the question of where everything came from to begin with, there is no particular help to be derived from adding God to the idea of evolution. The difficulties in the theory are still there, no matter if God is behind it or not. The modern philosophy of evolution and Orthodox teaching differ in their understanding not only of the past of man, but also of man's future. If the creation is one great filament which evolves and is transmuted into new species, then we can expect the evolution of Superman, which we will discuss shortly. If, however, the creation is made up of distinct creatures, then we can expect something different. We do not have to expect creatures to change or to rise up from the lower to the higher. Concerning the transmutability of kinds of creatures, the Holy Fathers have quite a definite teaching. The Holy Fathers use the word kinds, according to the word used in Genesis. Species is a very arbitrary concept, and we do not have to take it as a limit. Briefly, we will quote a few Holy Fathers about this. Saint Gregory of Nyssa quotes his sister Macrina on her deathbed, when she was speaking about this very question, opposing the idea of the pre-existence and transmigration of souls, which was taught by Origen. She says, in the words of Saint Gregory, "Those who would have it that the soul migrates into natures divergent from each other seem to me to obliterate all natural distinctions, to blend and confuse together in every possible respect the rational, the irrational, the sentient, and the insensate. If that is, all these are to pass into each other with no distinct natural order, secluding them from mutual transition. To say that one and the same soul on account of a particular environment of body is at one time a rational and intellectual soul, and that then it is caverned along with the reptiles, or herds with the birds, or is a beast of burden, or a carnivorous one, or swims in the deep, or even drops down to an insensate thing so as to strike out roots and become a complete tree producing buds on branches, and from those buds a flower or a thorn or a fruit edible or noxious. To say this is nothing short of making all things the same, and believing that one single nature runs through all beings, that there is a connection between them which blends and confuses hopelessly all the marks by which one could be distinguished from another. This shows very clearly that the Holy Fathers believed in an orderly arrangement of distinct creatures. There is not, as Erasmus Darwin would have it, a single filament which runs through all beings. Rather, there are distinct natures. One of the basic works of Orthodox teaching is The Fount of Knowledge by St. John Damascene. Footnote. This entire work is contained in St. John of Damascus, Writings, the Father, of the Church Series, Volume 37. Return to text. This great work of the 8th century is divided into 3 parts. The first part is called On Philosophy. The second is on Heresies, which tells exactly what the heretics believed and why we do not believe that. And the third part is on the Orthodox faith, which is one of the standard books of Orthodox theology. In On Philosophy, St. John begins with chapters which go into such things as what is knowledge? What is philosophy? What is being? What is substance? What is accident? What is species? What is genus? What are differences? What are properties, predicates? The entire Orthodox philosophy he presents is based on the idea that reality is quite distinctly divided up into different beings, each of which has its own essence, its own nature, and not one of them is confused with another. St. John Damascene meant that this part be read, and this philosophy understood, before one undertook to read his book of Orthodox theology, on the Orthodox faith. There are a number of basic books by Orthodox fathers which deal with the kinds of creatures. There are books called hexameron, which means 6 days, These are commentaries on the 6 days of creation. There is one by Saint Basil the Great in the East, one by Saint Ambrose of Milan in the West, and other lesser ones. There are commentaries on the Book of Genesis by Saint John Chrysostom and Saint Ephraim the Syrian, and there are many writings on these subjects scattered in the writings of many other Holy Fathers. The recent Holy Father Saint John of Kronstadt also wrote a hexameron. These books are very inspiring, because they are not mere abstract knowledge, they are full of practical wisdom. The Holy Fathers use a love of nature and the splendor of God's creation to give examples for us human beings. There are many quaint little examples of how we should be like the dove in its love for its mate, how we should be like the wiser animals and not be like the dumber animals, etc. In our own monastery, we can take an example from our squirrels. They are very greedy. We are not supposed to be like that. We should be gentle like the deer. We have all around us examples like that. In his hexameron, Saint Basil quotes God's words in Genesis, "Let the earth bring forth." This brief command, says Saint Basil, was immediately a mighty nature and an elaborate system which brought to perfection more swiftly than our thought the countless properties of plants. Elsewhere about God's commandment, "Let the earth bring forth vegetation," Genesis 1 verse 11, Saint Basil says, "At this saying all the dense woods appeared, all the trees shot up, all the shrubs were immediately thick with leaf and bushy, all came into existence in a moment of time." In the 9th homily of his hexameron, Saint Basil has a quote on the very question of the succession of creatures, one after the other. He quotes Genesis, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, cattle and creeping things and beasts of the earth," Gen 1:24. Saint Basil says about this, "Consider the word of God moving through all creation, having begun at that time, active up to the present and efficacious until the end, even to the consummation of the world. As a ball when pushed by someone, and then meeting with a slope is borne downward by its own shape and inclination of the ground, and does not stop before some level surface receives it, so too the nature of existing objects, set in motion by one command, passes through creation without change, by generation and destruction, preserving the succession of the kinds through resemblance until it reaches the very end. It begets a horse as a successor of a horse, a lion of a lion, and an eagle of an eagle. And it continues to preserve each of the animals by uninterrupted successions until the consummation of the universe. No length of time causes the specific characteristics of the animals to be corrupted or extinct. But, as if established just recently, nature, ever fresh, moves along with time. This is a statement not of science but of philosophy. This is the way God created creatures. Each one has a certain seed, a certain nature, and transmits that to its offspring. When there is an exception, then it is a monstrosity, and this does not invalidate the principle of the natures of things, each one of which is quite distinct from the other. If we do not understand the whole variety of God's creation, that is our fault, not God's. Saint Ambrose has a number of quotations along the same thse. His hexameron is very close to Saint Basil's in spirit. We have other quotes from Holy Fathers which show us a very interesting thing, that they were combating in ancient times something akin to the modern theory of evolution. This was the heretical idea that the soul of man was created after his body. The same idea is taught today by Christian evolutionists, although of course the ancient heresy is not the same as the modern theory. Those who taught the ancient heresy based their idea on a misinterpretation of Genesis 2 verse 7. "And God formed man of the dust of the earth, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul." Even today, Christian evolutionists seize on this passage and say, that means man was something else first, and then he became human. In ancient times, this false idea, that the soul was created after the body, was contrasted by the opposite, and equally false, idea of the pre-existence of souls. The Holy Fathers, in refuting both these theories, clearly stated that the soul and body of man were created simultaneously. Thus, St. John Damascene writes, "The body and the soul were formed at the same time, not one before and the other afterwards, as the ravings of Origen would have it." St. Gregory of Nyssa goes into greater detail in refuting both heresies. First, he describes Origen's idea of the pre-existence of souls, that is, that souls fell down into our world. Some of those before our time who have dealt with the question of principles think it right to say that souls have a previous existence as a people and a society of their own, and that among them also there are standards of vice and of virtue, and that the soul there, which abides in goodness, remains without experience of conjunction with the body. But if it does depart from its communion with good, it falls down to this lower life, and so comes to be in a body. Then St. Gregory describes the other heresy, which to the ideas of modern Christian evolutionists. Others, on the contrary, marking the order of the making of man as stated by Moses, say that the soul is second to the body in order of time, since God first took dust from the earth and formed man, and then animated the being thus formed by his breath. And by this argument they prove that the flesh is more noble than the soul, that which was previously formed than that which was afterwards infused into it. For they say that the soul was made for the body, that the thing formed might not be without breath and motion, and that everything that is made for something else is surely less precious than that for which it is made. Surely this theory, although it is in a different climate of ideas, is very close to the modern evolutionists' idea that matter indeed is the first thing, and the soul is secondary. St. Gregory of Nyssa refutes this theory as follows. Nor again are we in our doctrine to begin by making up man like a clay figure, and to say that the soul came into being for the sake of this. For surely in that case the intellectual nature would be shown to be less precious than the clay figure. But as man is one, the being consisting of soul and body, we are to suppose that the beginning of his existence is one common to both parts, so that he should not be found to be antecedent and posterior to himself, if the bodily element were first in point of time, and the other were a later addition. For we are to say that in the power of God's foreknowledge, according to the doctrine laid down earlier in our discourse, all the fullness of human nature had pre-existence. And to this the prophetic writing bears witness, which says that God knoweth all things before they be. And in the creation of individuals, not to place the one element before the other, neither the soul before the body, nor the contrary, that man may not be at strife against himself by being divided by the difference in point of time. For as our nature is conceived as twofold, according to the apostolic teachings, made up of the visible man and the hidden man, if the one came first and the other supervened, the power of him that made us would be shown to be in some way imperfect, as not being completely sufficient for the whole task at once, but dividing the work and busying himself with each of the halves in turn. Of course, the whole basis for an idea of evolution is that you do not believe that God is powerful enough to create the whole world by his word. You're trying to help him out by letting nature do most of the creating. The Holy Fathers also talk about what it means that Adam was created from the dust. Some people take the fact that St. Athanasius the Great says in his writings, the first created man was made of dust like everyone, and the hand which created Adam then is creating also and always those who come after him. And they say, that means Adam could have been descended from some other creature. He didn't need to be taken from literal dust. You don't have to take that part of Genesis literally. But it so happens this very point is discussed in great detail by many Holy Fathers. They come up with many different ways of expressing it, and make it absolutely clear that Adam and Cain are two different kinds of people. Cain was born of man, whereas Adam had no father. Adam was created of the dust, directly by the hand of Christ. Many fathers taught the same, St. Cyril of Jerusalem, St. John Damascene, and others. When we come to the question of what is to be interpreted literally in Genesis, and what is to be interpreted figuratively or allegorically, the Holy Fathers set forth for us very clear teachings. In his commentary, St. John Chrysostom even points out in certain passages exactly what is figurative and what is literal. He says those who try to make it all allegorical are trying to destroy our faith. For the most part, the truths in the book of Genesis are on two levels. There are literal truths, and there are also, many times for our spiritual benefit, spiritual truths. In fact, there are systems of 3 or 4 levels of meaning, but it is sufficient for us to know that there are many deeper meanings in the scriptures, and very seldom is the literal meaning destroyed. Only occasionally is the meaning entirely figurative. In general, we can characterize evolution in its philosophical aspect as a naturalistic heresy, which comes closest of all to being the opposite of the ancient heresy of the pre-existence of souls. Footnote: Father Seraphim was using the word heresy figuratively here. Elsewhere he explained that evolution is not strictly speaking a heresy, but an ideology that is profoundly foreign to the teaching of Orthodox Christianity, and it involves one in so many wrong doctrines and attitudes that it would be far better if it were simply a heresy and could thus be easily identified and combated. Return to text. The pre-existence of souls idea is that there is one kind of soul nature which runs throughout creation, while evolution is the idea there is one kind of material being which runs throughout creation. Both of these ideas destroy the idea of the distinct natures of created beings. The idea of evolution was a heresy that was lacking in ancient times. Usually orthodoxy is midway between two errors. For example, between the doing away with the divine nature by Arius and the doing away with the human nature by Monophysitism. In this particular case, the other heresy, evolution, was not incarnated in ancient times. This heresy waited until modern times to make its appearance. We will see much more clearly the philosophical side of evolutionism when we look at a few of the so-called Christian evolutionists. Chapter 3. Christian Evolutionism. Editor's note: this chapter has been culled from three sources. 1. A transcription of a lecture that Father Seraphim gave during his Orthodox Survival course in 1975, a continuation of the lecture contained in the preceding chapter. 2. Father Seraphim's own writings for an unfinished chapter he was working on with a public school teacher, and 3. Father Seraphim's miscellaneous notes on Teilhard de Chardin. The resulting composite provides a remarkably extensive treatment of Christian evolutionism, especially of Teilhard, whom Father Seraphim called the great evolutionist prophet of our times. 1. Introduction. There are forms of evolutionary philosophy, most notably the Marxist, which loudly proclaim themselves to be an all-sufficient philosophy of life, replacing the disproved philosophy of Christianity. Footnote. Karl Marx was a devout Darwinist, who in Das Kapital called Darwin's theory epoch-making. He believed his reductionist, materialistic theories of the evolution of social organization to be deducible from Darwin's discoveries, and thus proposed to dedicate his Das Kapital to Darwin. The funeral oration over Marx's body, delivered by Engels, stressed the evolutionary basis of communism. Just as Darwin discovered the law of evolution in organic nature, so Marx discovered the law of evolution in human history. Return to text. The arguments of these atheist evolutionists are naive in the extreme and full of self-contradictions, and there is no need to concern ourselves with them. Even many contemporary atheists, outside the Soviet orbit, realize that belief in God can neither be proved or disproved, but is arrived at or rejected by means of a kind of evidence quite different from scientific proof. However, there is nothing in the evolutionary view of the world in itself which requires it to be atheistic, and in fact the evolutionary theory makes much more sense to normal human reason if one has faith in at least some kind of God who puts the process in motion, guides it, etc. The philosophy of the world as a chance play of atoms, which themselves came into existence by chance, is satisfying only to the most limited and stunted minds. The outlook of the Orthodox Christian toward evolution, therefore, is by no means the simple one of the rejection of a philosophy which is openly anti-religious or anti-Christian. The more sophisticated evolutionists are all religious, to some degree, and there are many Christian evolutionists, some of them even having the reputation of being Orthodox theologians. Here we shall examine the views of some of these Christian evolutionists, all of them either claiming to be Orthodox Christians, or at least having their evolutionary views recommended by Orthodox Christians. In this way we shall be able to see the evolutionary philosophy at its best, reconciled with Orthodox theology as it were, and so we shall be able to begin to see whether the philosophy of evolution is really compatible with Orthodox Christianity. Here we shall not subject the views of these Christian evolutionists to detailed criticism, but will rather look to see what questions these views raise for Orthodox faith. These questions will then be examined in detail in our final section on the Orthodox patristic view of creation. In the last few years there have been articles, small articles, and some longer ones, in the Orthodox press on this very question of evolution. The official Greek Archdiocese newspaper, the Orthodox Observer, printed several articles which are quite surprising in that they are so far away from orthodoxy. One of these, Evolution, a Heresy, quotes the well-known Orthodox theologian Panayotis Trempelas. It appears more glorious and divine-like and more in harmony with the regular methods of God which we daily see expressed in nature to have created the various forms by evolutionary methods, himself remaining the first and supreme creative cause of the secondary and immediate causes to which are owed the development of the variety of species. This is the view of all Christian evolutionists, and it raises the extremely important question of whether it is possible to attain knowledge of God's creation by means of the regular methods of God which we daily see expressed in nature. This is by no means as simple a question as it might appear, and another, no less important question is raised by this view. What is it, then, that God created in the beginning, for evolution by definition is a process in time and must have a beginning. Did he create only the cosmic blob, to which atheist philosophers reduce the origin of the evolutionary process? Or must we be totally agnostic about this beginning, as many atheist philosophers tell us we must be? The article concludes, as long as Christians recognize the creative power of God in the process of evolution, it is both bold and hasty to call evolution a heresy. This conclusion reveals rather clearly the simple-minded approach to the whole question of the philosophy of evolution, which prevails in Christian evolutionists who have not given serious and critical thought to the real problems which this philosophy presents for Orthodox faith. The whole point of this article, which seems to present the viewpoint of many of the Orthodox clergy in America, i.e., those who have been raised in an evolutionary atmosphere without giving much thought to it, is this: if God is added to the theory of evolution, it becomes acceptable to Orthodox Christians. We are only against evolution if it is atheistic. But this is surely a very naive answer to a rather complicated question. What of the philosophy of evolution itself? Is it compatible with Orthodox Christian theology and philosophy, even with God added to it? All of the great heretics of history have also believed in God. Indeed, the demons also believe and tremble, James 2 verse 19. More rigorous thinking than this is required before an Orthodox Christian can know what to think of evolution. The article in the Greek Archdiocese newspaper says that evolution cannot really be a heresy because there are many Christians who believe in it. Besides Trempelas, it quotes two other Christian evolutionists, Leconte du Noyer and Teilhard de Chardin. Let us look for a moment at Leconte du Noyer and his views. 2. Leconte du Noyer. Pierre Leconte du Noyer was born in Paris in 1883 and died in New York in 1947. A widely known and respected scientist, mathematician, and physiologist, he wrote several books on scientific philosophy. His popular book, Human Destiny, sets forth his conclusions about evolution. It turns out he was not much of a Christian, for he believed that man created his own God, who is actually a formidable fiction. He was very patronizing towards Christianity. He believed that Christianity has been misunderstood and misinterpreted, but it is still good for the masses, and is a useful tool for man's continuing evolution on a moral and ethical plane. It has no objective, absolute truth. Christ is not God, but he's perfect man. Christian tradition, however, somehow helps to educate the race towards further evolution. He says, we are at the beginning of the transformations which will end in the superior race. Evolution continues in our time, no longer on the physiological or anatomical plane, but on the spiritual and moral plane. We are at the dawn of a new phase of evolution. It is difficult enough to find scientific evidence for physical evolution, but it is impossible to find evidence for spiritual evolution. Nevertheless, he believes in it. He says, our conclusions are identical with those expressed in the second chapter of Genesis, provided that this chapter is interpreted in a new way and considered as the highly symbolical expression of a truth which was intuitively perceived by its redactor or by the sages who communicated it to him. Of course, the book of Genesis was not written through mere human intuition. On the contrary, the Holy Fathers say that Moses heard from God the truths contained in it. St. John Chrysostom says the book of Genesis is a prophecy of the past. That is, Moses saw an exalted vision of what the world was in the beginning. St. Isaac the Syrian describes how such a vision can take place, how the soul of a holy man can ascend to a vision of the beginning of things. Describing how such a soul is enraptured at the thought of the future age of incorruption, St. Isaac writes, and from this one is already exalted in his mind to that which preceded the composition, making of the world, when there was no creature, nor heaven, nor earth, nor angels, nothing of that which was brought into being, and to how God, solely by his good will, suddenly brought everything from non-being into being, and everything stood before him in perfection. Monsieur Leconte du Noyer continues, let us try to analyze the sacred text as though it were a highly symbolical and cryptic description of scientific truths. This, of course, is extremely patronizing, as if poor Moses tried his best to get a scientific picture of the way things were, and all he came up with were these images. Leconte du Noyer explains, the omnipotence of God is manifested by the fact that man, descended from the marine worms, is today capable of conceiving the future existence of a superior being and of wanting to be his ancestor. Christ brings us the proof that this is not an unrealizable dream, but an accessible ideal. That is, Christ is some kind of Superman, and this is the ideal to which man is now evolving. Leconte du Noy gives us a new criterion of good and evil, which he says is absolute with respect to man. Good is that which contributes to the course of ascending evolution. Evil is that which opposes evolution. The respect of human personality is based on the recognition of man's dignity as a worker for evolution, as a collaborator with God. The only goal of man should be the attainment of human dignity with all its implications. He goes on to say that there are thinking men in all religions, and therefore all religions have a unique inspiration, a spiritual kinship, an original identity. He says, the unity of religions must be sought in that which is divine, namely universal, in man. No matter what our religion, we are all like people at the bottom of a valley, who seek to climb a snowy peak that dominates the others. We all have our eyes fixed on the same goal. Unfortunately, we differ on what road to take. One day, provided they never stop ascending, they must all meet at the top of the mountain. The road to it matters little. Of course, the top of the mountain is not the salvation of the soul. It is not the kingdom of heaven, but is precisely the chiliastic New Age. It may be seen with little difficulty that Leconte du Noy's views are not at all orthodox, or even vaguely Christian, but deistic. It is useful for us to know these views, however, because behind the surface of a religious relativism which no Orthodox Christian can accept, du Noy's evolutionary views are by no means untypical of contemporary Christian evolutionists, including many Orthodox Christians, and they raise philosophical and religious questions which any thinking Orthodox Christian must be prepared to answer. Let us mention here two groups of these questions. 1. As a corollary to the universality of evolution, which all evolutionists accept, everything in the world evolves, nothing is accepted from this natural process. He sees in the future of human evolution the coming of a superman or superior race. Also, he speaks of the future of human evolution as on the moral and spiritual plane. Can an Orthodox Christian believe in such things? If not, what reason does he have to exempt man from the otherwise universal natural process? 2. The book of Genesis, he believes, must be interpreted in a new way, symbolically. Specifically, the transgression of Adam was not an historical event, but simply the symbol of the dawn of human consciousness. Can an Orthodox Christian believe this? How does Orthodox Christianity understand the book of Genesis? 3. Father Anthony Costuros. Let us return now to the views on evolution of other Orthodox Christians. In another article of the Greek Archdiocese's Orthodox Observer, February 6, 1974, Father Anthony Costuros answers a question sent in by a reader. If Adam and Eve were the first humans, where did their son Cain get his wife? Does our church shed any light on this question? Father Costuros replies, man's origin is too far back in history for any person or group to know how man began. What, then, is the book of Genesis for? Science is still groping for answers. The word Adam denotes earth. The word Eve, life. Generally, and only generally, our traditional theologians take the view that all of us stem from one male and one female. There are others who feel that humankind appeared in clusters, a few here and a few there. No theologian has the definitive answer on the subject of man's origin and his development. The dawn of human history is a mystery. /4. According to Father Costuros, it is science that is trying to find the answer to this question. Evidently, the Orthodox interpretation of Genesis is quite symbolical and allegorical. We do not really know whether such a person as Adam ever existed. This is the view presented by the official Greek Archdiocese newspaper. And what of the Orthodox theology of Adam and the first created man? What of the Orthodox feast devoted to Adam and the other forefathers? What of those who have Adam for their patron saint? Is it a matter of indifference to an Orthodox Christian that the Church, if the Christian evolutionists are correct, may have been mistaken all these centuries in her teaching on this subject, and that this teaching may now have to be revised if science, after all, does come up with underscore the answer to the question of man's origin? Is it an exaggeration to say that it is extremely important for an Orthodox Christian to have a very clear view of the Church teaching on the origin of man, as well as a clear understanding of the limits of science in exploring this question? Later, in another answer to a reader's question, Father Costuros says, perhaps there are many Adams and Eves who appeared concurrently underscore in different areas, and then met. How man was created, and how man procreated initially is a mystery. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Our Church gives you the opportunity to ponder the subjects you mention and come up with your own speculation about them. The answer to the question, where did Cain get his wife, is actually very easy. Adam and Eve had many children who are not mentioned by name in Genesis. The account in Genesis is only the basic outline of the story. For Karl Rahner, Father Costuros mentions the possibility that humankind appearance in clusters. This is a reference to the evolutionary theory of polygenism. The prominent Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner, who until recently was rather conservative in his views on evolution, has examined this question and has made a reconciliation of the evolutionary view with the Christian doctrine in a way that will doubtless be imitated by the Greek Archdiocese in the future. Footnote: Karl Rahner, 1904 to 1984, is widely considered to be the leading Roman Catholic theologian of the 20th century. He served as an official papal theological expert before and during the Second Vatican Council. Return to text. In general, the Orthodox modernists are always one step behind the Roman Catholics in this process of updating the Church's views. In an article entitled Original Sin, Polygenism, and Freedom, summarized in Theology Digest, Spring 1973, Rahner posed two questions. 1. How is evolution compatible with the doctrine of Adam's preternatural gifts? 2. Can we think that the first man to evolve was capable of the first sin? He answers, scientists prefer to conceive hominization, i.e., the making of man, as having taken place in many individuals, a population, rather than in a single pair. Actually, some scientists think that and some don't. He says that it is the first group of recognizable men, original man, that committed the first transgression. Grace could be offered to the original group and, upon being rejected by that group's free and yet mutually influencing choice, be lost to the whole of succeeding humanity. Rahner then asks, in the first man or group such as paleontology reveals to us, how could there have been a degree of freedom sufficiently developed to have made possible such a fateful choice as original sin? How can we attempt to reconcile the supernatural or preternatural paradise situation of Adam, individual or group, with what we know of the origins of the biological, anthropological, cultural world? He answers his question by saying, it is not easy to determine precisely where and when an earthly creature actually became spirit and thus free. We may serenely reckon with the fact that original sin really happened, but at a moment which cannot be more accurately determined. It was sometime, within a fairly long time span during which many individuals may have been already existing and capable of performing the guilty act simultaneously. In other words, the whole thing becomes very vague. Obviously, the next generation of thinkers is going to do away with some of this double talk. 5. Stephanus Trooster. A recent book by another Jesuit sums up well the attitude of the enlightened Christian toward Adam and paradise. Stephanus Trooster is a Dutch Jesuit who, in his book Evolution and the Doctrine of Original Sin, states forthrightly, those who take the scientific doctrine of evolution seriously can no longer accept the traditional presentation. So we must find an interpretation that is relevant to our times. The proponents of the doctrine of evolution, he says, visualize mankind as a reality which, in the course of history, only very gradually matured to achieve a degree of self-realization. Its earliest emergence must be conceived of as fumbling transitional forms appearing next to extremely primitive levels of human existence. Such primitive intermediate forms of human life still must have been intimately fused with their prehistoric animal state. But in this evolutionary theory, there is no room for a paradisiacal existence of this prehistoric man. To place an extremely gifted and highly privileged spiritual man at the beginning of human life on earth appears in complete contradiction to modern scientific thought on this matter. This, of course, is true. Trooster continues. Acceptance of the modern viewpoint, however, eliminates the possibility of accounting for the genesis of evil in the world on the basis of sin committed by the first man. After all, how could so primitive a human being have been in a position to refuse God's offer of salvation? How could such a primitive being have been capable of a breach of covenant with God? Since for Trooster the fall of Adam is not an historical event, he explains the existence of evil by giving it a new name, the phenomenon of cosmic immaturity. Adam actually is not one man, he is every man. And the book of Genesis is an idealized image of a world without sin. The author of Genesis knows quite well it does not correspond to reality. He specifically did not mean to say that the original state of grace of Adam and Eve in all its purity was once upon a time an actual reality in the history of mankind. Of course, if you believe in evolution, it makes no sense to talk about paradise. You're only fooling yourself if you try to combine these two different forms of thinking. Theologians like Trooster have drawn thoroughgoing conclusions from the message of evolution. Is it possible to believe in evolution and not draw these conclusions? 6. The Roman Catholic view of original man. The Roman Catholics in the past have had some problems about knowing when man began, if one accepts evolution. There are different theories depending on what one thinks. I don't know what is allowed now, but in the old days you were not allowed to believe that man's soul could evolve from matter. You had to believe that man was given a soul at a particular moment. At that moment he became man, and therefore he was no longer subject to all the laws of evolution. Footnote. Commenting on Pope John Paul II's recent statement to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, October 22, 1996, that the theory of evolution is more than a hypothesis, Cardinal Thomas J. Winning of Scotland summarized the Roman Catholic Church's position on evolution as follows. The Church leaves the believer free to accept or reject the various evolutionary hypotheses, so long as they do not insist that the mind and spirit of man simply emerged from the forces of living matter with no room for God. The Glasgow Herald, January 11, 1997, page 19. Nevertheless, there are many Roman Catholics who remain opposed to evolution, including scientists who have written books and papers against it. Among these are Dr. Guy Berthault, geology, in France, Dr. Roberto Fondi, paleontology, and Dr. Giuseppe Sermani, genetics, in Italy, and Dr. Wolfgang Smith, physics, mathematics, in the United States. Return to text. Obviously, this is sticking in one of these epicycles, again to make the theory correspond to one's own beliefs. Either you believe in evolution, in which case man is a very primitive creature which came from the beasts, and the textbooks on evolution will tell you that man still has the savage inside of him, and all the pictures show him evolving from a monkey-like creature, or else you believe that man descended from a being who was greater than we are now, who was actually perfect man in his own way, and was not subject to corruption. The Holy Fathers even tell us that Adam did not void fecal matter. He had the tree of life to eat from, but he did not eat as we do now. In his conversation with Motovilov, Saint Seraphim of Sarov has a whole section on the state of Adam, how he was not subject to being injured or hurt. He was quite invulnerable to the elements, he could not be drowned, etc. It is interesting that, even in the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas asked precisely these questions and tried to solve them. What was the state of Adam? Did he void fecal matter? How was it that he could not be harmed? He has elaborate explanations. First of all, he says that Adam did void fecal matter, because we cannot believe that he would be of a different material than we are now. Secondly, he was never harmed and was impervious to drowning not because it was impossible, but because God arranged to take all the boulders out of the way, never to have the stream rise too high, etc. In other words, God arranged the world correctly, so that Adam walked very carefully and never happened to get hurt. But orthodoxy believes that our nature was originally immortal. Abba Dorotheus says this in the very first chapter of his Discourses, where he sets forth for us the image of Adam, the first man, to give us an inspiration of what we have to strive for and get back to. We are meant to live eternally in the body, and that is the way it was in the beginning. Only after falling did we lose that nature and that blessed state in which Adam was beholding God. According to orthodoxy, the immortal state of man in paradise was his nature. Our nature now is changed. Then we were potentially immortal. Now we have been changed into a mortal being, that is, mortal in the body. The Catholics teach, on the contrary, that the state of man in paradise was a supernatural state, that man actually was just like we know him today, mortal man, but God gave him an extra gift, a special state of grace. When he fell, he simply fell away from that extra grace which had been added to him, and therefore his nature was not changed. But according to orthodoxy, our very nature was changed and ruined at the fall. Christ is the new Adam, and in him we are restored to our old nature. Some fathers, like Saint Simeon the new theologian, discuss the question, why then did we not immediately become immortal when Christ died and resurrected? Saint Simeon says it was so that we would not be forced to be saved. We still must achieve our own salvation. And the creation is waiting for us to achieve our salvation, when it too will rise up to the state in which it was before the fall. In fact, even to a higher state. All this is filled with mysteries. It's beyond us, but still we know enough of it from the Holy Fathers. Saint Simeon has a long quote on the state of man before the fall, Asterisk the whole of creation, he says, was incorrupt just like man, and only after the fall did the creatures begin to die. When the new world comes, the new heaven and the new earth, Apoc 21:1, then the meek will inherit the earth, Matt 5:5. What earth is that? It is this earth you see right here, only it will be burned up and restored, so that all the creatures now will be incorruptible. That is what the whole creation is striving for, what the creatures are groaning after. When St. Paul said they were subject to vanity, Romans 8:20, this means they were subject to corruption through the fall of man. 7. Theodosius Dobzhansky. Let us turn now to an Orthodox Christian evolutionist, whose ideas are quite in harmony with recent Roman Catholic thought on the subject of evolution, and who brings up still other implications of the evolutionary theory, which any Orthodox Christian must study closely. Theodosius Dobzhansky is a Russian Orthodox scientist who is often quoted by other Christian evolutionists. A well-known geneticist, he is presently professor of genetics at the University of California at Davis. I think he still has his fruit flies, and is continuing to make experiments on them to prove evolution. Footnote: Father Seraphim is referring to Dobzhansky's attempt to create a new species by exposing fruit flies to radiation, so as to cause mutant offspring. Ian Taylor, in his book Jay and the Minds of Men, 1991, writes about such attempts. Experimentation with fruit flies began in the 1920s with Thomas Hunt Morgan, and today is still a minor industry among researchers. The stubborn fruit fly has endured every genetic indignity possible, but so far not one has ever produced anything except another fruit fly. Jay and the Minds of Men, page 163. Return to text. He was born in Russia in the year of the canonization of Saint Theodosius of Chernigov, 1900, in answer to prayer from his parents, and that is why he was called Theodosius. Alas, he became an apostate. He came to America in the 20s, and has been an American since that time. Footnote: Henry M. Morris writes, Dobzhansky was probably, next to Julian Huxley, the most influential evolutionist of the 20th century. Dobzhansky reposed in 1975, the same year that Father Seraphim gave the lecture from which this chapter has been taken. Return to text. He has been absolutely prohibited in Soviet Russia, although the Soviet scientists know about him. Once when a film was accidentally presented at one scientific meeting in Russia which showed him on it, all the scientists cheered, but the film was withdrawn. He is considered non-existent, a non-person because he left Russia. But he thinks like a communist. Although he was baptized Orthodox, when his wife died he had her cremated, took the ashes and scattered them in the Sierras. Footnote: Cremation is strictly forbidden in the Orthodox Church. Return to text. As far as one can see, he never goes to church, he's quite beyond religion. Nevertheless, for his Christian evolutionist views, he was granted an honorary doctorate of theology by St. Vladimir's Orthodox Seminary in New York in 1972. At the same time, he gave an address to the Second International Theological Conference of the Orthodox Theological Society of America, which was attended by all the renowned theologians of the various Orthodox bodies. His ideas on evolution, from what he and many official representatives of Orthodoxy in America apparently believe to be an Orthodox viewpoint, are set forth in two Orthodox periodicals, St. Vladimir's Theological Quarterly and Concern. In an article which was well publicized and summarized without comment in many Orthodox periodicals in America, Evolution, God's Special Method of Creation, Concern, Spring, 1973, Dobzhansky accuses anyone opposed to the theory of evolution of blasphemy. He says in this article, natural selection is a blind and a creative process. Natural selection does not work according to a foreordained plan. Dobzhansky notes the extraordinary variety of life on the earth and calls it whimsical and superfluous. He says, what a senseless operation to fabricate a multitude of species ex nihilo from nothing, and then let most of them die out. What is the sense of having as many as 2 or 3 million species living on Earth? Was the Creator in a jocular mood? Is the Creator playing practical jokes? No, Dobzhansky reasons. The organic diversity becomes, however, reasonable and understandable if the Creator has created the living world, not by gratuitous caprice, but by evolution propelled by natural selection. It is wrong to hold creation and evolution as mutually exclusive alternatives. What he means by this is that it actually makes no difference whether you have a God or not. He says that God makes 2 or 3 million species by means of natural selection. Is that any less silly than saying he created the original kinds all at once? According to Dobzhansky, there is no plan to it. It is all just a blind process. For an Orthodox Christian, this raises the question, does God begin the process of evolution and then have no control over its end? What of God's providence, without which not a hair of our head falls? Luke 21 verse 18. In this point of Christian evolutionary philosophy, we see how false is the very question which the evolutionist is striving to answer. The creative activity of God is not sufficient explanation for him of the diversity of the visible creation. There must be a better explanation, one based on the clearly unchristian presupposition that God is not in control of his own creation, that his providence does not exist. Footnote: Dobzhansky wrote, "Man has evolved from ancestors that were not human. The creation of God's image in man is not an event but a process, and therefore the moral law is a product of an evolutionary development." Dobzhansky, Ethics and Values in Biological and Cultural Evolution, Zygon, the Journal of Religion and Science, as reported in the Los Angeles Times, June 16, 1974, Part 4, page 6. Return to text. The God of this kind of evolutionary philosophy is clearly deistic, and the view of this Christian evolutionist is not to be distinguished from that of the semi-Christian, or non-Christian, Lecomte du Noyer. Dobzhansky is filled with the usual liberal Christian ideas that Genesis is symbolical, that man's awareness is the cause of the tragic meaninglessness in the world today, and that the only escape is for man to realize that he can cooperate with the enterprise of creation, for participation in this enterprise makes mortal man part of God's eternal design. And he says, the most gallant and by far the most nearly successful attempt to do this, cooperate with God's eternal design, has been that of Teilhard de Chardin. 8. Teilhard de Chardin. We will now look into this last evolutionist, who is the great evolutionist prophet of our times, Teilhard de Chardin. He is obviously the Christian evolutionist of the century, widely revered by Orthodox, and considered by some Orthodox theologians, as we shall see, as being on the same level as the Orthodox Holy Fathers. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, 1881–1955, was a French Jesuit priest, theologian, and paleontologist who was present at the discovery of many of the great fossil men of our century. He took part with two other people in the discovery of the fraudulent Piltdown man. Footnote: in 1953, it was discovered that the skull of Piltdown man skillfully combined the jaw of an ape with the skull of a modern man. Return to text. He discovered the tooth, which was dyed. It is not known whether he had a part in it. One of the other men has been accused of being the one who fabricated the Piltdown man, and it has been hushed up that Teilhard de Chardin had anything to do with it. But it is already known from the earlier books that he discovered the tooth. Footnote: Philip E. Johnson notes, many persons familiar with the evidence, including evolutionists Stephen Jay Gould and Louis Leakey, have concluded that Teilhard was probably culpably involved in preparing the Piltdown fraud, although the evidence is not conclusive. Darwin on Trial, page 203. Malcolm Bowden gives a detailed history of the Piltdown hoax in his books Ape Men, Fact or Fallacy, and Science versus Evolution. Return to text. Teilhard was present at the new discoveries of Java Man, which were incidentally all locked up in a closet somewhere in Holland, and not allowed to be examined again. He was present at many of the discoveries of Peking Man, though not at the very beginning. He was also present when the fossils of Peking Man disappeared. Footnote: throughout all the investigations regarding the whereabouts of the fossils, Teilhard, who had considerable responsibility for the laboratory and its collection, and lived in Peking throughout the war, never appears to have given his account of the events. Malcolm Bowden, Ape Men, Fact or Fallacy. Page 123. Return to text. So we have no fossils of Peking Man left, only drawings and models exist. Above all, Teilhard was the one who was chiefly responsible for the interpretation of all these findings. As he himself said, I had the good fortune, unusual in a scientific career, of happening to be on the spot when cardinal finds in the history of fossil men had come to light. He fit these together into evidence for human evolution. We won't go into this evidence now, except to say that it is very shaky. One evolutionist writer, F. Clark Howell, author of Early Man, has said, one of the prime difficulties is that really significant human fossil skulls are exceptionally rare. Everything which has been found to date could be tucked away in a large coffin. All the rest must be referred to something else. And we just don't know what the relation is of these pieces to each other. Teilhard de Chardin was both a scientist and a mystic. The surprising thing is not so much that he was a combination of these two, he was a Jesuit after all, but rather that he is quite respected both by theologians, Roman Catholic theologians, and in fact many Orthodox so-called theologians, and by scientists. His book The Phenomenon of Man has an introduction by Julian Huxley, the grandson of Darwin's famous contemporary and proponent, T.H. Huxley. Julian Huxley is an absolute atheist evolutionist. He cannot fully agree with Teilhard's attempt to reconcile Catholicism and evolution, but basically he agrees with his philosophy. This brings us to a subject we discussed earlier, man's expectation of the merging of religion and science. The earlier scientists in the West, at the birth of modern science during the Renaissance, were all mystically oriented. They were filled with Pythagorean philosophy. Giordano Bruno, 1548 to 1600, who is considered a forerunner of modern science and philosophy, was a mystical pantheist. He believed that the whole world is God, that God is the soul of the world, and that nature is God in things. His philosophy combined religion and science in a single pantheistic vision. In the 19th century, the socialist prophet Saint Simon said the time is coming when not only will the social order be a religious institution, but science and religion will come together, and science will no longer be atheistic. Teilhard de Chardin was the kind of thinker he was looking for, one who would bring together science and religion. Also in the 19th century, the American philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson spoke about the very same thing. Since he faced a situation in which man's faith had been divorced from knowledge because of modern enlightenment, he called for the restoration of unity in man, and spoke of how we can get faith and knowledge back together. He says this in his essay on nature. The reason why the world lacks unity, and lies broken and in heaps, is because man is disunited with himself. He cannot be a naturalist until he satisfies all the demands of the spirit. Love is as much its demand as perception. Deep calls unto deep, but in actual life, the marriage is not celebrated. There are innocent men who worship God after the tradition of their fathers, but their sense of duty has not yet extended to all their faculties. That is, they are dutiful to their own religion, but they do not dutifully pursue science and philosophy. And there are patient naturalists, but they freeze their subject under the wintry light of the understanding. That is, they divorce philosophy from religion. But when a faithful thinker, resolute to detach every object from personal relations and see it in the light of thought, shall at the same time kindle science with the fire of the holiest affections, then will God go forth anew into the creation. Again, Teilhard de Chardin is a prophet who promises to fulfill these expectations, who discovers that science and religion are once more compatible. Footnote: a more recent attempt to combine science, religion and evolutionary philosophy is found in The Marriage of Sense and Soul, Integrating Science and Religion by Ken Wilber, pages 103 to 11. For more about the union of science and religion, see the editor's epilogue of the present book. Return to text. In St. Vladimir's Theological Quarterly and Concern, Theodosius Dobzhansky summarizes what Teilhard de Chardin tried to do in his books. Teilhard, he says, describes 3 stages through which evolutionary development has passed, making use of his own technical terms. First, there is cosmogenesis, the evolution of inanimate nature. Second, biogenesis, biological evolution. And third, noogenesis, the development of human thought. Teilhard also speaks of spheres, the biosphere, the sphere of life, and the noosphere, the sphere of thought. He says the whole of the globe now is being penetrated by a web of thought, which he calls the noosphere. Up to here, continues Dobzhansky, Teilhard stands firmly on a foundation of demonstrable facts. To complete his theology of nature, he then embarks on prophecy, based on his religious faith. He speaks of his conviction, strictly undemonstrable to science, that the universe has a direction, and that it could, indeed, if we are faithful, it should, result in some sort of irreversible perfection. Dobzhansky quotes with approval the following statement of Teilhard de Chardin about what evolution is. Is evolution a theory, a system, or a hypothesis? It is much more. It is a general postulate to which all theories, all hypotheses, all systems must henceforward bow, and which they must satisfy in order to be thinkable and true. Evolution is a light which illuminates all facts, a trajectory which all lines of thought must follow. This is what evolution is. Footnote: elsewhere Dobzhansky himself echoes this Teilhardian view. Evolution on the cosmic, biological, and human levels are parts of one grand process of universal evolution, Dobzhansky, Ethics and Values in Biological and Cultural Evolution. Return to text. That is, evolution becomes in Teilhard's thought, which many people follow, whether they're Christian, atheist, or whatever, a kind of new universal revelation for mankind. And everything, including religion, must be understood in terms of evolution. The writings of Teilhard de Chardin are so filled with a jargon of his own invention that it is easy to dismiss, or accept, him without understanding the full significance of his thought. Above all, one must understand what it is that has inspired his thought, for it is this basic inspiration and worldview that has captured the fancy of the modern intellectual, Christian and atheist alike, despite the difficulty of his language. That which inspired Teilhard de Chardin, and inspires his followers, is a certain unitary view of reality, a joining of God and the world, of the spiritual and the secular, into a single harmonious and all-encompassing process which can not only be grasped by the modern intellectual, but can be felt by the sensitive soul that is in close contact with the spirit of modern life. Indeed, the next step of the process can be anticipated by the modern man, and that is why Teilhard de Chardin is so readily accepted as a prophet even by people who do not believe in God. He announces, in a very mystical way, the future which every thinking man today, save for conscious Orthodox Christians, hopes for. Footnote. That is, every person who is in the tradition of rationalism, coming from the age of the Enlightenment, and ultimately from the Middle Ages in the West after the Schism. Return to text. There are two sides to this unitary thought of Teilhard de Chardin. The worldly, by which he attracts and holds even total atheists such as Julian Huxley, and the spiritual, by which he attracts Christians and gives a religion to unbelievers. Teilhard's own words leave no doubt that first and foremost he was passionately in love with the world, with the earth. The world, its value, its infallibility, and its goodness, that, when all is said and done, is the first, the last, and the only thing in which I believe. Now the earth can certainly clasp me in her giant arms. She can swell me with her life, or take me back into her dust. She can deck herself out for me with every charm, with every horror, with every mystery. She can intoxicate me with her perfume of tangibility and unity. In this belief, he certainly leaves Orthodox Christianity behind. He believed, as one of his biographers accurately reports, that salvation was no longer to be sought in abandoning the world, but in active participation in building it up. He consciously abandoned the old forms of Christian spirituality in favor of new, secular ones. He disdained all those goody-goody romances about the saints and the martyrs. Whatever normal child would want to spend an eternity in such boring company. He believed that what we are all more or less lacking at this moment is a new definition of holiness. He wrote, "The modern world is a world in evolution. Hence, the static concepts of the spiritual life must be rethought, and the classical teachings of Christ must be reinterpreted." *degree. This is a reflection of the overthrowing of the old universe of Newton. Teilhard wants to put Christianity into the same category, because it also is bound up with the classical, static way of thinking. Now we have a new way of thinking, and therefore, just as we have a new physics, we must have a new Christianity. But Teilhard's philosophy is no mere secularization of Christianity. His most powerful and influential vision is that of the spiritualization of the world and worldly activity. Teilhard was not merely in love with the world and all modern progress and scientific development. His distinguishing mark was that he gave these things a distinctly religious significance. He wrote, "Then is it really true, Lord? By helping on the spread of science and freedom, I can increase the density of the divine atmosphere, in itself as well as for me, that atmosphere in which it is always my one desire to be immersed. By laying hold of the earth, I enable myself to cling closely to you. May the world's energies, mastered by us, bow down before us and accept the yoke of our power. May the race of men, grown to fuller consciousness and great strength, become grouped into rich and happy organisms in which life shall be put to better use and bring in 100-fold return. God, for him, is to be found only in the midst of the world. I am not speaking metaphorically when I say that it is throughout the length and breadth and depth of the world in movement that man can attain the experience and vision of his God. In perfect harmony with his secular yet searching times, he declares that the time has passed in which God could simply impose himself on us from without, as master and owner of the estate. Henceforth the world will kneel down only before the organic center of its own evolution. Evolution, for him, is not an idea destructive to religion, but a religious idea in itself. Christianity and evolution are not two irreconcilable visions, but two perspectives destined to fit together and complement each other. He ardently believed and taught that evolution has come to infuse you blood, so to speak, into the perspectives and aspirations of Christianity. Evolution, indeed, according to Teilhard, is preparing the way for a new revelation of God. The earth can cast me to my knees in expectation of what is maturing in her breast. She has become for me, over and above herself, the body of him who is and of him who is coming. Evolution, for Teilhard, is a process which involves the building of the cosmic body of Christ in which all things are united with God. A faithful son of the Roman Catholic Church, Teilhard expresses his vision of the union of God and the world in terms of Latin theology, offering a new development in Catholic thought in his striking idea of the transubstantiation of the earth. As our humanity assimilates the material world, and as the host, i.e., the Roman Catholic host, assimilates our humanity, the Eucharistic transformation goes beyond and completes the transubstantiation of the bread on the altar. Step by step it irresistibly invades the universe. The sacramental species are formed by the totality of the world, and the duration of the creation is the time needed for its consecration. Footnote: Teilhard wrote about this while in China in 1926-7, after having celebrated Mass in the Gobi Desert. Return to text. In this process of evolution, the body of Christ is being formed in the world, not the Christ of Orthodoxy, but the universal Christ or super Christ, which Teilhard defines as a synthesis of Christ and the universe. This evolving Christ will bring about the unity of all religions, a general convergence of religions upon a universal Christ who fundamentally satisfies them all. This seems to me the only possible conversion of the world, and the only form in which a religion of the future can be conceived. Christianity for him is not the unique truth, but only an emerging phylum of evolution, subject to change and transformation like everything else in the evolving world. Even like recent popes, Teilhard does not wish to convert the world, but only to offer the papacy as a kind of mystical center of man's religious quest, a superdenominational Delphic oracle. As one of his admirers summarizes his view, if Christianity is indeed to be the religion of tomorrow, there is only one way in which it can hope to come up to the measure of today's great humanitarian trends and assimilate them, and that is through the axis, living and organic, of its Catholicism centered on Rome. Footnote: Teilhard himself wrote, "Everything goes to show that if Christianity is in truth destined to be, as it professes, and as it is conscious of being, the religion of tomorrow, it is only through the living, organic axis of its Roman Catholicism that it can hope to measure up to the great modern humanist currents and become one with them." Teilhard de Chardin, Christianity and Evolution, p. 168. Return to text. At the same time that the universe is evolving into the body of Christ, man himself is reaching the pinnacle of his evolutionary development, superhumanity. Teilhard writes, "Evidence obliges our reason to accept that something greater than the man of today is in gestation upon the earth." Like Lecomte du Noyer, and indeed all thinkers who have a religious view of evolution, Teilhard identifies the evolving superhumanity with Christ and conversely interprets Christ in terms of superhumanity. In order to be able to continue to worship as before, we must be able to say to ourselves, as we look at the Son of Man, not apparet humanitas, but apparet superhumanitas, superhumanity has appeared. Here Teilhard's thought becomes mystical, and he does not state clearly whether human personality is preserved in superhumanity, or whether it is simply merged in the universal super-Christ. In the words of his biographer, humanity would reach a point of development when it would detach itself altogether from the earth and unite with Omega. A phenomenon outwardly similar to death perhaps, writes Teilhard, but in reality, simple metamorphosis and accession to the supreme synthesis. The supreme synthesis, the pinnacle of this evolutionary spiritual process, is what Teilhard called the point omega. One day, the Gospel tells us, the tension gradually accumulating between humanity and God will touch the limits prescribed by the possibilities of the world. And then will come the end. Then the presence of Christ, which has been silently accruing in things, will suddenly be revealed, like a flash of light from pole to pole. The spiritual atoms of the world will be borne along by a force generated by the powers of cohesion proper to the universe itself, and will occupy, whether within Christ or without Christ, but always under the influence of Christ, the happiness or pain designated for them by the living structure of the pleroma, the fullness of things. This point omega is not an otherworldly goal, but is only the end of the movement of the universe to its evolutionary goal. The climax of evolution is identified with the risen Christ of the parousia. All men, Teilhard believes, should desire this goal, for it is an accumulation of desires that should cause the pleroma to burst upon us. Again he writes, to cooperate in total cosmic evolution is the only deliberate act that can adequately express our devotion to an evolutive and universal Christ. Nevertheless, with or without man's will, the parousia will come, for N is the culmination of a natural process. The unique business of the world is the physical incorporation of the faithful in Christ, who is of God. This major task is pursued with the rigor and harmony of a natural process of evolution. Of course, he is completely doing away with all ideas of Christianity which have been hitherto. Christianity is not an individual trying to save his soul. It is everybody in the world evolving by a natural process up to the omega point. Christians should not fear the natural process of evolution, Teilhard believes, because it only brings them inexorably to God. Though frightened for a moment by evolution, the Christian now perceives that what it offers him is nothing but a magnificent means of feeling more at one with God and of giving himself more to Him. In a pluralistic and static nature, the universal domination of Christ could, strictly speaking, still be regarded as an extrinsic and superimposed power. In a spiritually converging world, this Christic energy acquires an urgency and intensity of another order altogether. 9. The Chiliasm of Teilhard de Chardin. Footnote: an early Christian heresy based on a misinterpretation of the Book of Apocalypse. Chiliasm can refer more generally to any secular or religious belief in the perfectibility of this fallen world. Return to text. There are a few more views of Teilhard de Chardin which we should mention. Interestingly, he looks for a state which will take us beyond the dead end of communism. During World War II he wrote that communism, fascism and democracy were all fighting each other, and that we must go beyond that. The great affair for modern mankind is to break its way out by forcing some threshold of greater consciousness. Whether Christians or not, the men who are animated by this conviction form a homogeneous category. The great event which we are awaiting is the discovery of a synthetic act of adoration in which are allied and mutually exalted the passionate desire to conquer the world and the passionate desire to unite ourselves with God. The vital act, specifically new, corresponding to a new age of the earth. One can see that in Teilhard, Chiliasm is very strong. The new age emerges. In communism, at any rate in its origins, faith in a universal human organism reached a magnificent state of exaltation. On the other hand, in its unbalanced admiration for the tangible powers of the universe, it has systematically excluded from its hopes the possibility of a spiritual metamorphosis of the universe. In other words, if you add spirituality to communism, you have the answer. Footnote: commenting on the Jesuit and Dominican worker priests, who in the 1940s and 50s joined communist and socialist parties, and who subsequently left the priesthood, Teilhard wrote, priest workers find in the face of a humane Marxism not only justice but hope and a feeling for the earth which is stronger than evangelical humanity. Quoted in Malachi Martin, The Jesuits, page 290. Elsewhere he said, Marxists believe in the future of mankind while present-day Christians do not. Quoted in Joseph V. Kopp, Teilhard de Chardin, A New Synthesis of Evolution. On the new spirituality that is being built on the foundations laid by communism, see the editor's epilogue below. Return to text. Teilhard goes on to say, we must unite. No more political fronts, but one great crusade for human advancement. The Democrat, the Communist, and the Fascist must jettison the deviations and limitations of their systems, and pursue to the full the positive aspirations which inspire their enthusiasm, and then, quite naturally, the new spirit will burst the exclusive bonds which still imprison it. The three currents will find themselves merging in the conception of a common task, namely, to promote the spiritual future of the world. The function of man is to build and direct the whole of the earth. We shall end by perceiving that the great object unconsciously pursued by science is nothing else than the discovery of God. That is how mysticism comes right into the middle of science. Science nowadays is losing all of its bearings. It has become indeterminate, positing a whole universe of antimatter, which mixes scientists up. Footnote: at present, evolutionary cosmologists are positing that as much as 90% of the matter in the universe is dark or exotic matter. Return to text. It all ends in mysticism. Teilhard writes, The only truly natural and real human unity is the spirit of the earth. A conquering passion begins to show itself, which will sweep away or transform what has hitherto been the immaturity of the earth. The call towards the great union, i.e., the universal unity of mankind, whose realization is the only business now afoot in nature. On this hypothesis, under which, in conformity with the findings of psychoanalysis, love is the primitive and universal psychic energy, does not everything around us become clear? The sense of earth is the irresistible pressure which will come at the right moment to unite them, all humanity, in a common passion. The age of nations is past. The task before us now, if we would not perish, is to shake off our ancient prejudices and to build the earth. The great conflict from which we shall have emerged will merely have consolidated in the world the need to believe. Having reached a higher degree of self-mastery, the spirit of earth will experience an increasingly vital need to adore. Out of universal evolution, God emerges in our consciousness as greater and more necessary than ever. At what moment in the new sphere has there been a more urgent need to find a faith, a hope to give meaning and soul to the immense organism we are building? Here he means that the whole modern revolution has lost itself. When it tries to build a new paradise, it destroys everything. Therefore, it needs to have a religious meaning added to it, and this Teilhard provides. All the things in modern life, he says, are good. Only add to them this, the idea that they are all heading for a new spiritual kingdom. Teilhard says further, in us the evolution of the world towards the spirit becomes conscious. We cannot yet understand exactly where it will lead us, but it would be absurd for us to doubt that it will lead us towards some end of supreme value. In this he is trying to be a prophet, but he is not really quite sure where it is all going. The generating principle of our unification is not finally to be found in the single contemplation of the same truth, or in the single desire awakened by something, but in the single attraction exercised by the same someone. Therefore, in spite of all the apparent improbabilities, we are inevitably approaching a new age in which the world will cast off its chains, to give itself up at last to the power of its internal affinities. With 2,000 years of mystic experience of Roman Catholicism behind us, the contact which we can make with the personal focus of the universe has gained just as much explicit richness as the contact we can make, after 2,000 years of science, with the natural spheres of the world. Regarded as a phylum of love, Christianity is so living that, at this very moment, we can see it undergoing an extraordinary mutation by elevating itself to a firmer consciousness of its universal value. Is there not now underway one further metamorphosis, the ultimate, the realization of God at the heart of the new sphere, the mental world, the passage of the circles, i.e., of all the spheres, to their common center, the apparition at last of the theosphere, i.e., when man and the world become God? This longing is very deep in modern man. This is what he wants. All modern philosophical, chiliastic, socialistic systems have as their end the idea that God is thrown out, Christianity is thrown out, and the world is divine. The world is somehow the body of God, and man wants to be a god. Now man has lost God, God is dead, the Superman wants to be born. Teilhard expresses modern man's desire for what Dostoevsky depicted in The Grand Inquisitor. He tries to unite the spiritual side with the scientific side, and with a new order which will be political. He is a prophet of Antichrist. Footnote: Father Seraphim's teaching on this subject is discussed more fully in the editor's epilogue. Return to text. And so with this, the modern rationalism in our time comes to an end. Reason finally comes to doubt or even to deny itself. Footnote: Earlier in his survival course, Father Seraphim spoke of how faith in pure reason was undermined. Towards the end of the Enlightenment by the philosopher David Hume, Immanuel Kant, and others. Some of this discussion has been included in the previous chapter, pages 318-24. Return to text. Science is upset. It does not know what matter is, what it can know and what it cannot know. Relativism pervades all spheres. For some, this doubt and relativism lead to the philosophy of the absurd. Footnote: A reference to the writers Camus, Kafka, Ionesco, etc. In the early 1960s, Father Seraphim wrote an essay called The Philosophy of the Absurd, which was published posthumously in the Orthodox Word No. 106, 1982. Return to text. It turns out that, having gone through all these experiments of the apostasy, man cannot develop anything more for himself. He tried everything, and each time he was confident that he had finally found the answer. As he did this, however, he overthrew more and more from the past. and always whatever he made was overthrown by the next generation. Now he comes finally to doubting even whether the world exists and what he is. Many people commit suicide. Many destroy. What is left for man? There is nothing left except to wait for a new revelation. And modern man is in such a state, having no value system and no religion of his own, that he cannot but accept whatever comes as being this new revelation. 10. Teilhardism in the light of orthodoxy. The evolutionary philosophy of Teilhard de Chardin is, strictly speaking, the product of the meeting of modern philosophy with Roman Catholicism. However strongly Teilhardism might seem to break with certain aspects of the ultramontane Roman Catholicism of yesterday, there can be no doubt that it is in profound harmony with and admirably expresses the deepest spiritual current of apostate Rome, the use of otherworldliness for this worldly, chiliastic end, or as recent popes have expressed it, the sanctification of the world. Within Roman Catholicism, Teilhardism is a new revelation, quite as justified and as traditional as the revelation of several centuries ago of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, which itself inspired one of Teilhard's mystical meditations in a monologue with God. 2 centuries ago, your Church, Roman Catholicism, began to feel the particular power of your heart. But now, we are becoming aware that your main purpose in this revealing to us of your heart was to enable our love to escape from the constrictions of the too narrow, too precise, too limited image of you which we had fashioned for ourselves. What I discern in your breast is simply a furnace of fire, and the more I fix my gaze on its ardency, the more it seems to me that all around it the contours of your body melt away and become enlarged beyond all measure, till the only features I can distinguish in you are those of the face of the world which has burst into flame. The revelation of the Sacred Heart, in this view, is thus merely a preparation for the still more universal revelation of evolution in our own times. Even in the 19th century, the reactionary Pope Pius IX, far from condemning the evolutionary views of St. George Jackson Mivart, conferred on him an honorary doctorate of philosophy after their publication, 1876. In Teilhardism, Roman Catholicism has come virtually to the farthest limit of its blasphemy against the true teaching of the Church of Christ. That which is called Christ in this philosophy is precisely what the Orthodox Church knows as Antichrist, the emerging pseudo-Christ who promises mankind a spiritual kingdom of this world. In this philosophy, the concept of and taste for the other world, the possession of which distinguishes Orthodox Christians from other men, is totally obliterated. As we have seen, Teilhard is deeply in harmony both with the modern outlook and with Roman Catholicism, both of which are now converging in a new worldview. He rightly saw that evolution, if it is true, cannot be kept in one compartment of human thought, but profoundly affects the whole of thought. He was unconcerned to reconcile evolution with single points of Christian tradition and dogma, because he rightly saw that there is no possible reconciliation. Evolution is a new revelation to man, and it is the single most important part of the worldview of the third age of the Holy Spirit, which is now coming upon the last humanity. Footnote: a reference to the chiliastic prediction of Joachim of Fiore, the 12th century Latin abbot who saw the 2 ages of the Father, Old Testament, and the Son, New Testament, giving way to a final third age of the Holy Spirit. This teaching was taken up in the 13th century by the Franciscan spirituals, who viewed Joachim as their prophet. In the 19th century, it was revived by the anti-Orthodox Russian thinker Nicholas Berdyaev, who predicted the advent of a new and final revelation, the new age of the Holy Spirit characterized by a new spirituality and a new mysticism. In it there will be no more of the ascetic worldview. See Father Seraphim Rose, Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future, pages 33. Return to text. In the light of evolution, everything must change, not just the static worldview of Holy Scripture and the Holy Fathers, but one's whole outlook toward life, God, and the Church. The simple Orthodox believer who may accept the idea of evolution innocently because he has been told it is scientific, will doubtless be bewildered at the Teilhardian idea of evolution, and wonder what possible connection it has with the scientific facts which everyone accepts today. It is time, then, finally, to approach the answers to the questions about evolution and Christian faith which the study of Christian evolutionism has raised. Not everyone who believes in some form of evolution can accept the pseudo-mysticism of Teilhard de Chardin, but this blasphemous mysticism is only a most logical deduction from views whose full implications are entirely unrealized by those who accept evolution in some form. Unknown to most Orthodox Christians, the Holy Fathers of the Orthodox Church have set forth a clear teaching on the nature of the world, God's creation, and the first created man, which answers all the questions that modernist Orthodox theologians, who do not know the Orthodox teaching of the Fathers, think are so uncertain and difficult. Teilhard's monstrous view of the Omega was made possible precisely because evolutionary philosophy first obscured the Alpha, that is, the Orthodox doctrine of the creation of the world and man. Orthodox theology in our own time has come so much under the influence of this modern philosophy that most Orthodox theologians no longer teach the Orthodox doctrine of God's creation. The ideas expressed in the official organ of the Greek Archdiocese of America by the conservative theologian Panayotis Trempelas, if he has been correctly quoted, by Theodosius Dobzhansky and St. Vladimir's Theological Seminary, which awarded him an honorary doctorate, by periodicals of the American Metropolia, Orthodox Church in America, and the Standing Conference of Canonical Orthodox Bishops in America, are so far from orthodoxy that one can only marvel at the Western captivity that has enchained these Orthodox Christians who are, after all, free to read the Holy Fathers and think for themselves. But let us not be shocked by this mediocre ignorance. Before approaching the teaching of the Holy Fathers themselves, let us examine briefly the views of Orthodox theologians, who accept even the teaching of Teilhard de Chardin himself as orthodox, and reveal thereby not merely their profound ignorance of Orthodox teaching, but even more their captivation by a teaching totally and utterly foreign to Holy Orthodoxy. 11. Orthodox followers of Teilhard de Chardin. Teilhardism seems to have made a deep impression on Russian Orthodox liberals after the translation and publication, significant in itself, of The Phenomenon of Man in Moscow in 1965, the first book of a Christian thinker. If one accepts the propaganda volume of Hewlett Johnson, the Red Dean of Canterbury, to be published in the USSR. Footnote. In his book The Jesuits, 1987, Father Malachi Martin comments on Teilhard's connection with Marxism. For Teilhard, Marxism presented no real difficulty. The Christian God on high, he wrote, and the Marxist God of progress are reconciled in Christ. Little wonder that Teilhard de Chardin is the only Roman Catholic author whose works are on public display with those of Marx and Lenin in Moscow's Hall of Atheism. The Jesuits, page 290. Return to text. After this publication, Father John Meyendorff of the American Metropolia wrote, "The Christocentric understanding of man and the world which, according to Teilhard, are in a state of constant change and striving towards the omega point, that is, the highest point of being and evolution, which is identified by the author with God himself, connects Teilhard with the profound intuition of the Orthodox Fathers of the Church." More specifically, the editor, presumably Nikita Struve, of the Orthodox periodical from Paris, messenger of the Russian student Christian movement, writes, "It should be noted that the chief characteristic of Teilhardism is not at all the acceptance of evolution. This has been no novelty for a long time among theologians and religious philosophers. The soul of the teaching of the French thinker is a new approach to the problem of the world and creation. In his teaching on this, Teilhard only sets forth in contemporary language the teaching of the Apostle Paul concerning nature, which is not excluded from the plan of salvation. When reflecting on the mass of the world, Teilhard's experiences were for him something like a cosmic liturgy which is invisibly performed in the world. Here is the very heart of the Teilhardian proclamation, which restores to us the forgotten, immemorially Christian understanding of the universe and the divine incarnation. Precisely, it illuminated for Teilhard the meaning of evolution as the movement of the whole cosmos toward the kingdom of God, and enabled him to overcome the negative approach to the world which is deeply rooted among Christians. The Messenger's major Orthodox article on Teilhardism is by a Polish Orthodox priest, Father George Klinger, and is entitled Father Teilhard de Chardin, an Orthodox Tradition. This author finds that Teilhard's thought so often uncovers points of approach to the best traditions of orthodoxy, and he then proceeds to quote these best traditions of orthodoxy, which are the 3rd-century heresy of Montanism. The evolutionism of Eastern thought is confirmed in the study of Montanism, which saw the appearance of the 3 hypostases of the Holy Trinity in 3 successive epochs of human history. The 12th-century Latin monk Joachim of Fiore, with his prophecy of the coming 3rd age of the Holy Spirit, to replace the ages of the Old and New Testaments, and the whole Paris modern school of Bulgakov, Berdyaev, and their liberal followers. He does quote a few genuine fathers also, but not one of these quotes is supportive of the idea of evolution. Indeed, no one will doubt that there is a kinship between these sources and evolutionary philosophy, nor that the whole charismatic ecumenical New Christianity of our own times has deep roots precisely in the doctrine of evolution, that all this has nothing whatever to do with orthodoxy and the Holy Fathers of the Church. Father George Klinger is so far from orthodoxy that he does not hesitate to follow Teilhard de Chardin into his dizzying vision of the cosmic or super-Christ. Father Teilhard speaks much on the cosmic role of Christ, of the divine milieu, and very little of the Church. In this case too he converges with tendencies akin to him in Orthodox theology. In Father Teilhard, the Church is identified with the working of Christ in the cosmos. And again, according to Father Teilhard, through communion of the holy mysteries the world being sanctified becomes the body of Christ. These thoughts are possibly the profoundest that have been said in recent times on the question of the central sacrament of Christianity. Enough has been said to show how far the Orthodox followers of Teilhard de Chardin wander from sound Orthodox doctrine, and how profoundly ignorant they are of the true teaching of the Holy Fathers of the Orthodox Church whom they so glibly mention. The patristic illiteracy of our own day is so great that any theologian can say virtually anything and attribute it to a Holy Father and not be corrected. Particularly with regard to evolution, it is allowed to make extremely vague statements which seem to give a patristic justification for belief in this modern doctrine. The Greek Fathers had a cosmic view, which makes them akin to Teilhard de Chardin. The Fathers didn't interpret Genesis literally, which means we are free to interpret it in terms of evolution. Genesis lends itself to an evolutionary interpretation, according to our modern wise men who do not know the Fathers. The hexameron of St. Basil is favorable to evolution. Footnote: such vague statements were made by Father John Meyendorff in an article entitled Creation versus Evolution, published in the Orthodox Church, the official organ of the Orthodox Church in America. Having introduced the subject of the biblical account of the creation, Father Meyendorff writes, "The New Testament clearly affirms that some Old Testament accounts are to be understood spiritually as an allegory." Galatians 4 verse 24. In his famous sermons on the 6 days of creation, St. Basil the Great holds the view that God created the world in one moment, and then left it rolling under his own guidance, but also in accordance with its own created laws. Clearly, St. Basil does not understand biblical chronology literally. He fully accepts the scientific ideas of his own day, and his understanding seems quite compatible with the idea of a God-guided evolution. Creation versus Evolution. The Orthodox Church, Volume 18, Number 3, March 1982. This statement, of course, contains gross misrepresentations. In Galatians 4 verse 24, St. Paul is speaking specifically of Abraham's 2 sons being an allegory of the 2 covenants, from which we are obviously not to conclude that St. Paul thought that Abraham and his sons did not actually exist as historical persons. And as we have seen, St. Basil wrote in his commentary on the 6 days of creation that the Scripture should be understood as it has been written. St. Basil taught that God made everything according to the Genesis chronology in instantaneous creative acts on each of the 6 days, that the 6 days were real days, and that one kind of creature could not be transformed into another. See pages 386, 401 below. Return to text. One could multiply such examples of loose thinking. We have seen enough of these feeble speculations of modern thinkers. It is time now to go to the Fathers themselves to reveal what they have to say on the questions affecting the doctrine and philosophy of evolution. What are the spheres of science and theology? How must an Orthodox Christian interpret the book of Genesis? Who was he first man? When did he live? What was his origin and nature? What vast the state of the first created world? Who is able to see things as they were in the beginning? We shall seek answers to such questions taught of 1 or 2 of the Fathers only, not of dubious fathers or in obscure works, not by taking quotes out of context so as to fit preconceived notions. Rather, we shall ask the Fathers of undisputed authority in the Orthodox Church, and seek to find what the patristic mind is on this question. We shall investigate the commentaries on Enosis of St. John Chrysostom and St. Ephraim the Syrian, the commentaries on the 6 days of creation by St. Basil the Great and St. Ambrose of Milan, the catechetical works of St. Cyril of Jerusalem, St. Gregory of Nyssa, St. John Damascene, the homilies on Adam and the first created world by St. Simeon the new theologian and St. Gregory of Sinai, the theological writings of St. Macarius the Great, St. Gregory the theologian, St. Isaac. The Syrian, Saint Abba Dorotheus, Saint Gregory Palamas, and other fathers, as well as the witness of the divine services of the Orthodox Church. We find there much that is new o many Orthodox Christians, especially since many of these writings have not been translated into English. We shall find there not many details concerning things which are beyond us, but a precise and coherent doctrine of that which we need to know. We shall find that the most pressing questions raised by the doctrine of evolution are answered for us. We shall find there the inspiring patristic doctrine of the first creation, the nature of Adam, and the final state of all creatures, which makes tasteless and vain for us the omega of Teilhard de Chardin, and all the empty speculations of those who have not had knowledge of the first and last things which God has revealed to his chosen people, Orthodox Christians.